Silas Marlowe's hand cracked across Tessa's face before she even finished speaking. She stumbled backward into the kitchen shelf, jars rattling, one hitting the floor and shattering. The sound of it glass exploding across stone was the only thing loud enough to cover the sound she made. Not a scream. Something smaller than that. Worse. Silas straightened his collar. Calm, like he'd swatted a fly. You went into my study. Not a question. Tessa pressed her fingers to her cheek. Her hand was shaking. I was looking for the household ledger. Don't. His voice dropped. Don't make me say it twice, Tessa. You went through my private cabinet. Couldn't deny it. Couldn't lie fast enough. And Silas Marlowe had spent 2 years learning exactly how long it took her face to give her away. He smiled. That was the worst part, the smile. You have no idea what you just stepped into. If this story already has your pulse running, you haven't seen anything yet. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part of Tessa's story until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Wyoming Territory 1887. The storm had been building since mid-afternoon. Anyone with enough years behind them could read a Wyoming sky the way they read a neighbor's face the particular gray that meant business. The stillness before the wind changed directions. The way cattle started pressing toward the fence lines before the first drop fell. Tessa Marlowe had lived on the edge of the Red Hollow Basin for 2 years. She had learned the sky. She had learned the land. What she hadn't managed to learn, what Silas had very deliberately prevented her from learning, was what to do when she finally decided to run. She was running now. The road was mud. Not the soft kind. The kind that grabbed at boot heels and sucked them downward with every step, that punished anyone foolish enough to move fast across it. Tessa moved fast anyway. Her skirts were soaked through to the skin. Her hair had come completely loose from its pins and hung in dark ropes against her face. She was breathing in short, painful bursts, not because the cold had gotten into her lungs, though it had, but because the corset Silas insisted she wear every day of her life was not designed for a woman fleeing across a Wyoming mountain road in the middle of a November storm. She had left the house with one thing. She hadn't even taken a coat. The ledger was tucked against her body, beneath her dress, pressed flat against her ribs. It was the only thing she'd thought to grab. Not money. Not a letter. Not a name of someone who might help her. Just the ledger. Because the ledger was the only thing in that house that Silas Marlowe was actually afraid of. She had found it 3 days ago. She had been looking for household accounts genuinely, not suspiciously, simply trying to understand why the feed supplier had stopped delivering to the ranch when Silas had told her twice that he'd renewed the contract. She had pulled the wrong drawer. The false bottom had come loose when her hand caught the corner. And the ledger had been lying underneath, wrapped in oilskin, locked, but the key had been sitting right there beside it, which told her something important about Silas Marlowe's vanity. He never truly believed anyone in his household would dare. She had dared. She'd read 20 pages before she understood what she was looking at. She'd read 40 before she understood she was in danger. By the time she'd finished, her hands had gone numb and the lamp was burning low, and she could hear Silas's boots on the porch steps below. And she had understood with absolute clarity that every day she remained inside that house was a day she might not survive. The slap had come the following morning. Not because he'd caught her with the ledger. She'd been fast enough to return it. The slap had come because he'd seen something shift in her eyes at breakfast, some small failure of performance that gave her away, and Silas Marlowe was a man who noticed small things. You're hiding something, he'd said. She'd denied it. He'd hit her anyway. Because the hitting wasn't really about what she'd done. The hitting was a reminder of what he could do. It had always been that way. 2 years of that particular lesson. Tonight she was done learning it. Her left ankle turned on a buried rock, and she went down on one knee, hands plunging into the mud. She stayed there for a moment, just a moment, breathing through her teeth, trying to get her balance back. Cold was serious now. It had moved past uncomfortable and into the kind of temperature that made your fingers stop working and your thoughts start going sideways. She pushed herself upright, kept walking. The road curved north toward the canyon passage and then connected, eventually being the problem. eventually being 8 or 9 more miles with the town of Garrett's Crossing, which was the nearest place. Silas Marlowe did not have friends. Red Hollow was closer. Red Hollow was out of the question. Silas owned Red Hollow the way a man owned a horse. Not officially. Not on paper. Just in every way that actually mattered. He owned the sheriff's time and loyalty because he'd paid off Orson Pike's gambling debts 3 years running. He owned the bank because the bank president's brother had borrowed money from Silas during a bad season and hadn't paid it back. He owned the county judge because, well, Tessa had read the ledger, and now she knew why Judge Calder ruled the way he ruled, and the number written beside his name had made her stomach turn. Red Hollow would hand her right back. She knew that, which was why she was walking through a Wyoming storm in November without a coat, with a stolen ledger pressed against her ribs, trying to make it to a town 9 miles away. She had made it approximately 3. When her legs stopped working, they stopped without warning. Not a gradual slowing, just gone. Like the cold had finally severed the connection between what she wanted and what her body could do. She went down beside the road, not falling so much as folding, and the mud received her, and the rain came down, and for a little while there was nothing except the sound of water hitting everything. She was aware that this was bad. She was also aware that she couldn't move. She lay there with the ledger pressed to her chest, and the cold working its way through her like it owned her, and she thought about Silas's face when he'd smiled at her. Particular smile, the one that said she was exactly as small as he'd always told her she was. She thought about the 11 names in the ledger, 11 families, 11 ranches methodically destroyed. She thought about a widow named Miriam Holt whose husband had died the winter after Silas foreclosed on their land, and whose complaint to the territorial office had been rerouted and buried and never answered. She thought, I am not going to let him have this. And she pushed herself onto her hands and knees in the mud. That was when she heard the horse. Ronan Vale was not in the habit of riding after dark in a November storm. He was 42 years old and had been working cattle in Wyoming since he was 19, which meant he had enough experience to know that the territory would kill a man who was reckless about weather. He had also been awake since before dawn, had spent 14 hours on horseback, moving a stubborn portion of his herd to winter pasture, and had every reason to be inside his cabin with a fire going and a plate of something hot in front of him. What he was doing instead was riding south along the canyon road at 11 o'clock at night in a storm because he had seen a light moving across the lower basin 3 hours ago, and then it had gone out, and something about that had bothered him. Ronan Vale was bothered by things he couldn't explain, and he had learned over the years to pay attention to that feeling rather than reason himself out of it. He nearly missed her. The shape in the mud didn't look like a person at first, just a darker mass against the dark road, and his horse had shied sideways before he'd seen it with his own eyes. He dismounted. She was on her hands and knees when he reached her. Moving, barely, but moving, trying to push herself upright, her arms shaking with the effort, her hair completely obscuring her face. Hey, he crouched beside her. Hey, are you... Don't touch me. Her voice came out fast and low and sharp, and she twisted away from him even though she couldn't stand. Ronan pulled his hand back. All right. He kept his voice level. All right, I won't touch you. You're on the canyon road 3 miles south of any shelter, and the temperature is dropping. I need you to tell me if you can stand. A pause. I can stand. She could not stand. He watched her try and fail and try again, her jaw locked with the effort of it, and he didn't reach for her because she'd asked him not to. Finally, she said through her teeth, "Help me up." He got her onto her feet. She was a solid woman, full-figured, tall for a woman, with real weight to her, and she swayed when she stood, and he kept his hands on her arms until she found her balance. She lifted her face and looked at him, not with gratitude. Assessment, trying to read whether he was safe. Ronan understood that look. He'd seen it on cornered horses and on people who'd been hit one too many times. He kept his face still and gave her a moment to decide. I need to get to Garrett's Crossing, she said. You need to get inside and warm, he said. Garrett's Crossing is 6 more miles. I'm aware of that. You almost froze to death on this road, I know. And you still want to go 6 more miles in this. Something moved across her face. Pride, or stubbornness, or maybe something harder to name. I don't have a choice. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. My place is a mile east, he said. You get warm, you sleep, you tell me nothing you don't want to tell me. In the morning, you decide what happens next. She studied him. Why would you do that? Because you're going to die on this road if you keep walking, he said. And I've had enough things die on my watch. He didn't say it to make her feel something. He said it because it was true. She seemed to understand the difference, because after a moment she stopped arguing. He helped her onto his horse. She struggled, and she was heavier than some people would have expected, and he helped her without comment because there was no comment to make, and then he led the horse east through the storm toward the ranch. She didn't speak. He didn't either. At some point during the ride, he felt her hand grip the back of his coat. Just once, when the horse lurched on a wet rock, she let go as soon as they were steady, like she hadn't meant to do it. Ronan said nothing about that either. She was out cold before he got her inside, not unconscious sleeping. The difference mattered. He'd laid her down beside the stove on the bedroll he kept there for bad winters, and she'd simply gone under, the way the body sometimes did when it had been running on emergency for too long and suddenly realized it was somewhere it didn't have to. He built the fire, made coffee, sat in the chair across the room, and waited to see if she'd wake up, or if he needed to be more worried. She woke at first light. She came awake fast, not the gradual surfacing of someone sleeping safe, but the sudden full-body alertness of someone who had learned to wake up ready to move. Her eyes were open and scanning the room before she'd even fully sat up. They landed on him. Ronan was standing at the stove with a coffee cup in his hand, not doing anything threatening, just standing there. But he'd been watching her, because he'd been trying to figure out from her face while she slept what had happened to her. Old habit. You could learn a lot from a sleeping face. She pulled the blanket around herself. Her movement was quick and self-conscious, wrapping the wool around her full body, like she was sealing something away from view. Don't, her voice was low, not angry exactly, but braced. Don't look at me like that. Ronan blinked. He'd been read wrong before, plenty of times. But this particular wrong reading stopped him cold, because he'd been looking at her face, specifically at the deep bruise along her cheekbone that had darkened overnight into something serious, and trying to understand what kind of man had put it there. He hadn't been thinking about anything else. He set his coffee cup down. I was wondering, he said, how somebody who looks that scared still managed to run 3 miles through a Wyoming storm. She stared at him. He watched her process that, watched her wait for the punchline or the cruelty, watched her slowly figure out there wasn't one. My face, she said finally. Flat. What about it? You weren't. She stopped. Started again. People usually. I know what people usually. She didn't answer that. Ronan pulled the second chair up to the stove and sat down, leaving plenty of space between them. You want coffee? Yes. He poured it, handed it over without asking how she took it. She took it black, which told him something. You don't have to tell me anything, he said. That's still true from last night. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Someone's going to come looking for me, she said. Probably. Before noon, most likely. Probably that too. That doesn't concern you. He looked at her directly. Depends on whether whoever's coming has a right to take you back. She met his eyes. He doesn't. Then no, Ronan said. It doesn't concern me much. Her name was Tessa. She gave him that, and not much else that first morning, just Tessa. No last name, though the quality of her clothes when they dried told him she wasn't poor, and the bruise on her face told him whatever she'd run from, she'd been right to run. Ronan didn't push. He had work to do. 2 of his fences had taken storm damage, and the cattle on the north pasture needed checking. He told her he'd be back by midday, told her where the food was and where the water pump was, and then left her in the cabin alone. Partly because she needed space, partly because he wasn't sure what to do with a person sitting in his house, and he needed to think. He was 300 yards from the cabin when it came to him. Marlowe. He didn't know her last name, but he knew the bruise, and he knew the quality of those clothes, and he knew that there was only one man in this corner of Wyoming who was powerful enough to own a woman the way that woman had been owned, and whose name Ronan Vale had spent 7 years learning to hate without ever saying out loud. Silas Marlowe. Ronan stopped walking. He stood in the middle of his north pasture in the aftermath of the storm, with mud on his boots and frost in the air, and thought about the signature on the bottom of the foreclosure. Notice that had taken his father's ranch when Ronan was 35 and his father was 62 and too sick to fight it. Silas Marlowe. He thought about his father, sitting at the kitchen table of the house he'd built with his own hands, reading that notice, and the particular kind of stillness a man fell into when the last thing he'd believed in was taken away. His father had died 2 years later. Not from the foreclosure. Exactly. But Ronan had always thought the foreclosure had a hand in it, the way hard things sometimes reached back and kept taking. He stood in the pasture for a long time. Then he went back to fixing the fence. She was still there when he got back. He'd half expected her, not to be expected her to have decided on her own and gone, but she was sitting at his table with a piece of paper in front of her and a stub of pencil working across it, and she didn't look up when he came in. "I ate some of the cornbread," she said. "I left you most of it." "Counting. I'm making a list," she said. He looked at the paper. Numbers, names, amounts, a sequence of transactions written from memory in small, precise handwriting. "What is that?" She finally looked up. "Evidence," she said, "in case they take the ledger." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "The ledger," he said. She reached under her blouse and drew it out thick. Oilskin wrapped, and clearly valuable, the kind of document a man went to considerable trouble to protect. She set it on the table between them. "My husband is Silas Marlowe," she said. Not like a confession, like she was stating a problem out loud. Ronan's jaw tightened. Tessa watched that. "You know him," she said. "I know of him. Is there a difference?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. "He foreclosed on my father's ranch in 9,880. My father had a medical debt, and Silas Marlowe acquired it from the original creditor and then called it in with 6 days' notice. 6 days to come up with $1,200. His voice stayed even. It had had 7 years to get that way. My father couldn't. We lost the property. About 300 acres, 2 water rights, and the house my father built." Tessa's hands went still on the table. "I'm sorry," she said. And she said it in a way that didn't sound like a social nicety. She sounded like a woman who meant it and understood it. "It's in here," he said, nodding at the ledger. His name. "Thomas Vale," she said it quietly. "Page 41. Acquisition cost, $218. Current assessed value of the property, $4,200. She had his father's name memorized. Ronan sat with that for a moment. "You memorized the whole thing?" he finally said. "Most of it." She looked down at the paper in front of her. "Numbers stay with me. I don't know why. They always have." He watched her hands still trembling slightly, not with cold now, but with something else, and thought about what it would take to go through a man, Silas Marlowe's private records and hold every figure in your head, and then run 3 miles in a storm carrying the physical proof, and then wake up alone in a stranger's cabin and immediately start writing it all down in case something happened to the original. "He's going to send people for you," Ronan said. "I know." "Who does he have?" "The sheriff, for certain. Orson Pike." Her voice shifted on the name, not quite contempt, but close. "He has 3 hands willing to do his ugly work, and he'll go to Judge Calder for a writ if he thinks he needs it. Does Pike know the way here?" "Every man in the basin knows where Ronan Vale's ranch is." He looked at her. She said his name like she'd known it before this morning. "How do you know my name?" "'Cause when I was trying to figure out who might be safe," she said, "I remembered something Miriam Holt told me at a church social 2 years ago, before Silas stopped letting me attend them. She said there was a rancher east of the Canyon Road who had no love for Silas Marlowe and enough stubbornness to prove it." She looked at him steadily. She said if I ever needed somewhere to go, Ronan Vale's place was east. Ronan thought about Miriam Holt, whose husband had worked himself into an early grave after Silas took their land. He thought about the kind of thing a woman told another woman at a church, social, quiet, careful, specific, not knowing whether it would ever be used. "Miriam Holt's a smart woman," he said. "She is." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, calculating. The sheriff would come. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow at the latest. He needed to know what they were doing and why before Pike arrived, or the conversation on his porch was going to go badly for both of them. "Tell me about the ledger," he said. "All of it." Tessa looked at him. Then she started talking. She talked for almost 2 hours. Ronan had expected a summary, What he got was a detailed reconstruction, not just the names and amounts, but the system, the machinery of it. How Silas had built a structure for destroying ranches that looked legal at every individual step and was catastrophically fraudulent when you saw it whole. He would identify a property he wanted, usually a ranch in temporary difficulty, bad season, medical debt, a death in the family. He would acquire the debt from the original creditor, often at a fraction of its value. He would then wait for the worst possible moment, winter, illness, harvest failure, and call it in with impossible speed. If the family somehow managed to pay, he had other methods. Manufactured liens, false boundary surveys, intimidation delivered through hired men who never worked directly for Silas on paper. If a family complained to territorial authorities, their complaints were rerouted through county channels through Judge Calder, who returned them unacted upon. If a wife wrote letters seeking help, the letters were intercepted. That was my job, Tessa said quietly, intercepting the letters. I didn't know that's what I was doing. He had me managing household correspondence, and some of it was addressed to neighboring counties, and I would forward it, and he told me it was business, and She stopped. I didn't read them, she said. For the first year, I didn't read them. Ronan waited. The second year, she said, I started to read them. He understood what that meant, what it took, what she'd been living with since. He told me nobody else would have married me, she said. Not emotionally just stating a fact. He said it often enough that I started to treat it as information. And when you treat a lie as information long enough, it starts to shape how you move through rooms, how much space you think you're allowed to take up. She looked down at her hands. The ledger told me he married me because I had useful skills, not because I was pathetic enough to accept him, because I was intelligent enough to be used. Ronan said nothing for a moment. Then, did knowing that help? She thought about it honestly. Some, she said, and it made me furious in a completely different way. He almost smiled. Didn't. The evidence in there, he said, nodding toward the ledger. Is it enough? If we can get it to the territorial marshal. She slid the written summary across the table toward him. Harlan Crow. He's based out of Cheyenne. He is not on Silas's list. You checked. I checked. Ronan picked up the summary, looked at it, at the handwriting compact, precise, organized by date and name, and then at the woman who had produced it from memory, alone in a stranger's cabin, before noon. He set it down. First we deal with Pike, he said. When he comes. What do you mean deal with? He's going to come here and ask for you back. We need to figure out what you want to say. She straightened. I want to say no. That's what I was hoping, he said. Pike came before 2 o'clock. Ronan heard the horses at the edge of his property and went outside to the porch without being asked. Tessa came to stand behind him, not behind him in the way of someone hiding, but behind him in the way of someone choosing where to stand. 3 riders, Pike in front, 2 deputies trailing. The sheriff had a broad red face that went redder in the cold, and a jaw he thrust forward when he was on official business, which gave him a permanent look of being mildly affronted. He reined up at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Ronan with the confidence of a man who had always been bigger than the rooms he walked into. Ronan Vale Sheriff. I'm told you have something of Silas Marlowe's. Ronan's face stayed completely still. I have a woman who walked to my door in a Wyoming storm, he said. She's not something. Pike's jaw pushed forward another fraction. Tessa Marlowe is a married woman who has abandoned her home and her husband. He looked past Ronan. Mrs. Marlowe, your husband is concerned for your welfare and asks that you come home. Tessa stepped forward. Ronan stayed where he was. Ask her, he said. Not me. Pike looked at Ronan with irritation. I wasn't asking you. No, Ronan agreed. You were telling her. I'm suggesting you ask instead. Every man on horseback looked at Tessa. She knew this moment. She had been preparing for it since the morning, running it through her head while Ronan was out fixing fence. She'd thought about what Silas had taught her, that her voice was inconvenient, that her opinion muddied things that should be simple, that other people found her exhausting. And she had thought about the ledger page with Thomas Vale's name on it. And she had thought about Miriam Holt's husband, dying broken in a winter he should have survived. She looked at Sheriff Orson Pike. No, she said, not loud. Not performed, just the word, standing alone. Pike stared at her. Mrs. Marlowe, I am not going back. She kept her voice even. Not today. Not tomorrow. If my husband wants to discuss this, he can discuss it in a proper legal proceeding with witnesses present. You don't have grounds. I have grounds. She said it flat. I have more grounds than you currently know about. I suggest you speak with Mr. Marlowe again before you decide whose side of this to stand on. Pike's red face got redder. He looked at Ronan. You're making a serious mistake, Vale. I make those sometimes, Ronan said. Marlowe has the judge. I know what Marlowe has. Ronan met his eyes without blinking. Go tell him you found her. Tell him she said no. Tell him she had something to say about legal proceedings. He paused. Tell him she's comfortable where she is. Pike sat on his horse for a long moment, calculating. Then he turned and rode back the way he'd come. His deputies followed. Ronan waited until they were out of sight. Then he turned around. Tessa was still standing in the same spot. Her arms were at her sides. Her hands were shaking. That was the first time, she said quietly. In front of people. That's the first time I said no in front of people. Ronan looked at her. How did it feel? She took a slow breath. Terrifying, she said. And I would do it again in about 30 seconds. And Ronan Vale, who had not laughed in longer than he cared to think about, made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a laugh, but was something adjacent to one. Come inside, he said. We have work to do. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Ronan knew a man in Garrett's Crossing, a retired land agent named Burl Hastings, who had no connection to Silas Marlowe and enough legal experience to understand what they were looking at. If they could get the ledger to Hastings, and Hastings could get a written summary to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne, they might be able to move before Silas could bury the evidence or threaten his way out of an investigation. The problem was getting the ledger out without Silas's people intercepting it. Because Pike had come once, and he would come again, and the second time he would have a writ. He's going to tell Silas I mentioned legal proceedings, Tessa said. She was studying the map Ronan had spread on the table, an old survey map, hand-marked, that showed the roads and water crossings for 20 miles in every direction. Silas is smart. He'll understand that I didn't say that unless I have something. And he'll move fast, Ronan said. He always moves fast when he's afraid. Is he afraid of you? She considered that. He wasn't, she said. He thought I was a useful piece of furniture. Now, she paused. Now he's not sure what I am. Ronan studied the map. There's a rider I trust, he said. Name's Caldenny, young but steady. I can get him to carry papers to Garrett's Crossing tonight under cover of dark. Silas doesn't know his face. And the ledger itself. Stays here until we know the marshal is moving. Then we figure out how to get it to Cheyenne without going through county channels. That's the part I keep worrying about, she said. Even if we get word to Crow, even if he takes it seriously, Silas will see the investigation coming before it arrives. He has too many eyes in too many places. Then we need to move before he knows we're moving. She looked up from the map. There was something working behind her eyes, some calculation running, and Ronan recognized it because he'd seen it all day. The way her mind went, thorough, fast, careful, always checking itself. There's something else we could do, she said. But you won't like it. Tell me anyway, she told him. He didn't like it. The idea was this. Tessa would go back. Not permanently. Not to stay. Just long enough to get her hands on a second document, a separate set of accounts that's kept in a locked box in the study, distinct from the ledger, that contained records of his communications with Judge Calder. The ledger proved the fraud. The communications proved the cover-up. Together, they were airtight. Separately, Silas's attorney could argue the ledger was selective, incomplete, taken out of context. I know the house, Tessa said. I know where he keeps things. I know his habits. He'll expect you to be frightened, Ronan said. He'll be right, then. But he'll also expect me to perform that fright in a specific way, she said. He's been teaching me how he expects me to behave for 2 years. I know his version of me better than he does. She paused. I can be what he expects long enough to get what I need. Ronan was quiet for a long time. You'd be alone in that house with him. I know. If something goes wrong, I know. Tessa. He believes I'm stupid, she said. Her voice was steady. He believes I'm desperate. He believes I have nowhere to go and no one who would want me. He told me those things so many times, they became automatic. He doesn't even think about them anymore. They're just true to him. She looked at Ronan directly. His certainty about what I am is the best weapon we have. Ronan looked at her. He'd met a lot of people in 42 years. He'd met brave people and determined people and people who had good reasons to be angry. He hadn't met many people who could take the worst thing that had been done to them and deliberately turn it into the instrument of the person who'd done it. "You're not what he told you," he said. It came out before he'd thought about it. She looked at him carefully, like she was trying to figure out if it was a line. "I know," she said eventually. "I'm starting to remember that." Outside the cabin, the wind had dropped. The storm was passing. The night was going to be clear and cold and quiet, and somewhere to the west, in the enormous ranch house that sat on land stolen from 11 families, Silas Marlowe was going to be planning his next move. Tessa looked back at the map. "We need to move in the next 2 days," she said. "Before he gets the writ." Ronan nodded. He reached across the table and took the ledger. "I'll get Denny tonight," he said. "Papers go to Garrett's Crossing before morning." He looked up. "And we make a plan for the rest." Tessa looked at the ledger in his hands, at her own handwriting on the summary sheet beside it, at the window where the wind had gone quiet and the sky was starting to clear. She thought about walking into Silas Marlowe's house again. Her stomach turned over. Her hands were steady. "Make it a good plan," she said. Cal Denny was 19 years old and had the particular quality that Ronan had learned to value above almost everything else. In a young man, he didn't ask unnecessary questions. Ronan woke him before midnight, explained what needed to go to Garrett's Crossing and who needed to receive it, handed him a sealed envelope containing Tessa's written summary and a note from Ronan to Burl Hastings, and watched the boy ride out into the clear, cold dark without a single word of complaint. Tessa was still awake when Ronan came back inside. She was sitting at the table with the ledger open in front of her. Not reading it, she'd read it, but checking something in the back pages that she'd been thinking about. She looked up when the door opened, then back down. "He's gone?" "Riding south." "Silas has a man who watches the Garrett's Crossing road sometimes," she said. "Near the fork at Linder Creek. Cal knows a different way." She looked up again. "You've done things like this before," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Not exactly like this. Ronan poured himself the last of the coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. "But I've moved things across this basin that people didn't want moved. Cattle, mostly. Once some documents for a family named Ruiz that Marlowe was trying to foreclose on. Didn't work out for them in the end, but not for lack of trying." She was quiet for a moment. "The Ruiz family," she said. "They're in the ledger. Page 63. Ronan set the cup down. "I know," he said. "I figured that out this afternoon." She closed the ledger and pressed her palm flat on the cover. The gesture was deliberate, not protective exactly, more like someone placing their hand on something they were making a commitment to. "Some sleep," Ronan said. "Tomorrow's going to require you to be sharp." She nodded, but neither of them moved for a moment, and the silence in the cabin wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had too much to think about and had temporarily run out of words for it. "Thank you," she said finally. "For last night. For not asking me to explain myself before you helped me." Ronan looked at her. "You were about to freeze to death," he said. That seemed like the more pressing issue. Some people would have asked questions first. Some people, he said, would have left you there and said it wasn't their business. She looked at him steadily. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly, the way she seemed to appreciate. "Because it was my road," he said. "Anything on my road is my business." She almost smiled. Almost. "Get some sleep, Tessa," he said again. This time she did. Morning came clear and brutal, the kind of Wyoming November morning that looked beautiful from inside and tried to kill you the moment you stepped out. Ice had formed on the water trough overnight. The cattle on the north pasture were standing close together, their breath making a collective cloud in the still air. Ronan was outside before sunrise. He worked methodically: water, feed, fence check on the east line, where the storm had weakened 2 posts, moving fast enough to stay warm, thinking about the timeline they were working against. Pike would go back to Silas. Silas would think. Silas was not a stupid man. That was the thing people sometimes forgot when they were angry at him. He was careful and patient, and he had built his operation over 15 years with exactly the kind of long-term thinking that most men in the territory didn't have. He would know something was wrong. He would not wait to be outmaneuvered. Ronan was back inside by the time Tessa woke up, and she woke up the same way she had the morning before fast. Complete, eyes scanning, but this time she oriented to him immediately, and her body didn't go rigid. Small thing. He noticed it anyway. She ate standing up, which he gathered was her habit, and she looked out the window toward the south while she did it, like she was reading the road from that distance. "He'll send Pike again today," she said, with the writ. "Or he'll come himself." She paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Silas doesn't come himself," she said. "He doesn't do things that can be witnessed." "Then Pike, with a writ and more men. We can't hold them off with a no this time." "No," Ronan agreed. She set the fork down. "Did Hastings write back?" "Denny won't be back before tonight at the earliest." She turned from the window. Her face had that working quality again, the calculation running underneath, checking angles. He had started to understand that this was simply how her mind operated, that it was almost involuntary, the same way some men's hands move toward a tool when they saw a problem. "Then we need to deal with today on our own," she said. "I've been thinking about that," Ronan said. "There's a woman in Red Hollow named Cora Finch. She runs the boarding house. She and Silas have bad history. He tried to acquire her property 3 years ago, and she fought him off by going to a land agent in Cheyenne directly. She knows how he operates." He looked at Tessa. "She might be willing to let you stay there temporarily. In town, visible, somewhere Pike can see you're not being held or hidden. Makes it harder for Silas to paint this as a man keeping another man's wife." Tessa considered that. "Staying with you makes me look like I ran off," he said slowly. "Staying at a boarding house in town makes me look like a woman handling a marital disagreement through appropriate channels." That was my thinking. She was quiet for a moment. "It also makes me visible to Silas's people," she said. "Yes, which is a risk." "Yes," she looked at him. "You're not trying to talk me into it or out of it. You're just showing me the options." "That's your choice to make," Ronan said. "Not mine." She picked up her fork again and finished her breakfast. "Take me to see Cora Finch," she said. "I'll make the choice after I meet her." Cora Finch was a small, angular woman in her 60s who moved around her boarding house like she owned every inch of it, which she did, and who looked at Tessa in the doorway with the particular examining look of someone who had seen a lot of things come through that door and had gotten very good at reading them. She looked at the bruise on Tessa's face for about 2 seconds. Then she looked at Ronan. "She one of Marlowe's?" "She was," Ronan said. Cora looked back at Tessa. "You the one who ran?" "Yes," Tessa said. "Smart." She stepped aside and let them in. The boarding house was warm and smelled like breakfast and wood smoke, and 3 men at the long table in the dining room looked up briefly when Tessa and Ronan came in, then looked back at their plates with the practiced incuriosity of people who had learned not to ask questions about other people's circumstances. Cora led them to the small sitting room off the kitchen, closed the door, and lowered herself into a chair. "I've got a room," she said. $2 a week. I don't ask questions about what happened, and I don't answer questions from people who come looking." She fixed Tessa with a direct look. "But I need to know if you've got something on him. Because if you don't, this is just you sitting in my house while he builds a better case. And I've seen that end badly." Tessa reached inside her dress and put the ledger on Cora's side table. Cora looked at it, then at Tessa. "What is that, his private accounts?" "Every ranch he's taken in this county going back 12 years. Every bribe, every manufactured debt, every name of every official he's paid for." She paused. "It's been sent in summary form to Burl Hastings in Garrett's Crossing, who is contacting the Territorial Marshal's office." Cora was quiet for a moment. "Harlan Crow? If Hastings can reach him." Cora pressed her lips together in a way that might have been satisfaction. "Marlowe tried to take my property in '84, she said to no one in particular. "I had to mortgage 2 years of savings to hire someone in Cheyenne to fight the lien he filed. My husband had been dead 6 months." She looked at the ledger. "Is his name in there?" "No," Tessa said. "But the method is. What he did to you, it's the same method, documented on 11 other properties." Cora looked at the ledger for another moment. Then she looked at Ronan. "You're a fool for getting involved in this," she said. "Probably," he said. "But you're a useful kind of fool." She stood up. "I'll get the room ready. You stay as long as you need to." She picked up the ledger and held it out toward Tessa. "Keep this on you. Don't tell anyone else it exists until you're ready to use it." Tessa took it back. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. Don't thank me yet," Cora said. "Marlowe finds out you're here. My house becomes a problem." "I know, then you understand I'm taking a risk." "I do." Cora nodded. That seemed to be enough. Red Hollow was not a large town. It had a main street with the usual general store, bank, blacksmith, the sheriff's office at the south end, and the boarding house at the north. It had a saloon that did reasonable business on weeknights and considerable business on weekends. It had a church it was proud of, and a schoolhouse it was less proud of, and a population of about 240 people, most of whom knew most of the others, and a fair number of whose livelihoods had some connection, direct or indirect, to Silas Marlowe's operation. What Red Hollow also had, as Tessa had understood for 2 years, was a remarkably efficient system for moving information. By early afternoon, the fact that Tessa Marlowe was staying at Cora Finch's boarding house had traveled to most of the town's significant ears. The version Silas had been telling traveled with it. He had been telling anyone who asked, and some who hadn't, that his wife had suffered some kind of emotional episode and had run off in the storm, and was currently being kept from her home by a man who had his own grievances against. Silas was using Tessa as a way to act on them. He said it carefully and consistently, the way he did all things. And he said it with the particular kind of sorrow that men in his position had learned to deploy the long-suffering husband, confused and worried, willing to take her back despite everything. Some people believed him immediately. They were the same people who had always believed him, because believing him was easier and safer than not. Some people were less certain. And a few people, mostly women, mostly those who had sat near Tessa Marlowe at the church socials Silas had eventually stopped letting her attend, who had noticed how she held herself and what happened to her eyes when her husband's name came up in conversation. Those few people were not believing him at all. Tessa became aware of the stories within an hour of arriving. She was sitting in the small room Cora had given her, which looked out over the alley behind the boarding house and had a heavy bolt on the door, when Cora came in and told her. "He's saying you left of your own disturbed mind," Cora said, with a directness that had no cruelty in it, just fact. "Saying Ronan Vale has been filling your head with nonsense against your husband." Tessa absorbed this without visible reaction. "And the bruise?" she said. "He's saying you fell during the storm." "Of course he is." Cora sat on the edge of the bed. "Most people are going to believe what's convenient," she said. "It's not new. But there are women in this town who will believe you without needing the ledger. The question is whether you want to involve them." Tessa looked at her. "Miriam Holt," she said. "She's one." "Who else?" Cora told her. There were 4 names. Women who had reasons of their own, or whose families had reasons. Not all of them were willing to be visible. Some had children and couldn't afford the risk. But 2 of them, Miriam Holt included, had nothing left that Silas Marlowe could take from them. "I don't want to put anyone in danger," Tessa said. "They're already in a kind of danger," Cora said. "The kind that comes from having no recourse. You're offering them one." Tessa looked out the window at the alley. She thought about walking into a courtroom, or whatever form the accounting for all of this eventually took, and standing up alone. Then she thought about not standing alone. "Set up a meeting," she said. "Tonight if possible." The meeting happened in Cora's kitchen at 9 o'clock. After the dining room boarders had gone to their rooms. 4 women, counting Tessa. Cora made coffee and sat at the end of the table and didn't say much, which turned out to be its own form of control. She let the conversation find its own shape. Miriam Holt was a woman in her late 50s with the worn, angular quality of someone who had worked a ranch for 30 years and been left to figure out survival on her own when it was taken away. She had the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from having burned through the agitation a long time ago and arrived at something harder. She looked at Tessa across the table and said, "How bad is it in there?" "The ledger." "Bad enough," Tessa said. "Your husband's name is in there. The amount Silas paid to acquire your debt, the amount he resold the property for, and a notation about redirecting your complaint to the county office." Miriam's jaw went tight. "He rerouted my letters?" "Through Judge Calder's clerk. There are 3 separate complaints from you documented, all returned without action." The other two women, a younger widow named Patience Garver, whose family's land had been adjacent to Silas's western range, and an older woman named Agnes Keel, who ran the dry goods store and whose husband had done bookkeeping for Silas years ago before quitting abruptly, both went still. Agnes, Tessa said carefully, your husband, does he still have records from when he worked for Silas? Agnes looked at her coffee cup. He might, she said. Kept copies of things. He wasn't sure why at the time. Said it felt like the prudent thing to do. She paused. He's been afraid to say anything about it for 6 years. If he's willing, Tessa said, those records could corroborate what's in the ledger independently. That makes it much harder for Silas's attorney to argue I invented any of it. Patience Garver had been quiet until now. She was younger than the others, maybe 35, with a direct way of looking at people that suggested she had been raising children alone long enough to have stopped being patient with things that wasted her time. What happens to us, she said, if this doesn't work? If Crow doesn't come, or Silas gets to him first, or the judge throws it out? Nobody answered immediately, because it was an honest question, and it deserved honesty. It gets harder, Tessa said. Silas knows about me now. He'll know about any of you who are visibly connected to this. He'll find pressure to apply. That's a yes to my question. Yes. Patience looked at the table. Then she looked up. My children's father is buried on land that belongs to Silas Marlowe now, she said. So I'm going to tell you something. There is not a single thing that man can do to me that is worse than watching him keep it. She looked around the table. What do you need from me? They talked until past midnight. By the time the meeting ended, they had a framework, not a plan exactly, more like a series of commitments. Miriam would produce her written complaints, all 3 of them, and testify if it came to that. Agnes would speak to her husband about his records. Patience would contact 2 other families she knew of who had lost land quietly to assess their willingness. Tessa walked back upstairs to her room, feeling something she had nearly forgotten the texture of. Not safety, not optimism exactly, just the particular sensation of not being alone in something. She sat on the bed and put the ledger on the table beside her and looked at it. She thought about Silas's face the morning he'd hit her. The ease of it. The way he'd straightened his collar afterward like it had been nothing more than an interruption to his morning. She thought about 2 years of walking through rooms trying to take up less space. She picked up the ledger and held it. Then she put it back down, lay on the bed fully dressed, and slept better than she had in a year. Ronan came back the next morning. He looked like he hadn't slept much, which turned out to be accurate. He'd ridden to Garrett's Crossing himself in the night to check on Denny, and the news from Hastings was partial but not nothing. He told her in the alley behind the boarding house, standing close enough to keep their voices from carrying. Hastings received the summary, he said. He's read it. He agrees it's significant. He's sent a rider to Cheyenne. How long? Cheyenne's 4 days hard ride. A week if the weather turns. And Crow will need time to review it before he can move officially. He paused. Minimum 2 weeks before we could expect any federal presence. Tessa worked through that. We need to hold Silas off for 2 weeks, while also keeping the ledger secure, while also not giving him grounds to have me taken by legal order. She leaned against the wall. He'll get the writ within 2 days. Probably today. Pike serves it, and then whether I've been held against my will or left of my own choice stops mattering. Can Cora fight a writ? Not indefinitely. Not without a lawyer. I know a man in Ronan, she said it quietly. The writ is secondary. The real problem is the secondary documents, the Calder correspondence. She looked at him directly. We need them before Silas realizes how much trouble he's actually in. Because the moment he knows a federal marshal is coming, those papers disappear. She watched him understand what she was still proposing. You want to go back into that house, he said. I want to finish what I started. Tessa, I know the risk. You know half the risk, he said, and his voice had something in it that she wasn't used to hearing directed at her. Not anger. Something closer to fear. The other half is what happens if he decides he doesn't care about being witnessed anymore. She met his eyes. He won't, she said. Not yet. He still thinks he can manage this quietly. If I go back looking frightened, looking like I made a mistake, he'll believe it because he needs to believe it. His whole operation depends on nobody fighting back. And if he doesn't believe it, then I run again. And this time I know where I'm running. He looked at her for a long time. His jaw worked. "I'll be close," he said finally, not visible. "But close. I know you will. You can't signal me. If it goes wrong in there, you have to get out on your own before I can reach you. I understand that, do you?" She looked at him steadily. "Ronan, I got myself out of that house with his ledger while he was in the next room. I know how to move through that building when I need to." She paused. "I'm scared. I'm also the best option we have." He said nothing for a moment. "Then, what do you need from me? A plan for where I go if I get out with the documents. A specific place, specific time, and she hesitated. If I'm not out by 3 in the morning, come for me anyway. I'll be there at 3. Don't come before that. He'll have men watching." "I know." He looked at her, something moving briefly across his face that was too complicated to name. "Don't make me come before 3. I'll do my best." "That's a terrible answer. It's the only honest one." He made that sound again, not quite a laugh, adjacent to one, and shook his head. "Tonight?" he asked. "Tonight," she said, "while he still thinks he's winning." They stood in the alley a moment longer, in the cold morning, the sounds of the town starting up around them. Cart on the main street, someone calling across a fence line. The ordinary machinery of a place that had no idea what was being decided behind its boarding house. "When this is over," Ronan said, and then stopped. "What?" He looked away. "Nothing. Go eat something. You look like you've been up since 5. She had been up since 4, but she didn't correct him. She pushed off the wall and headed toward the back door. "Ronan." He turned. "When this is over," she said, "I want to hear the rest of that sentence." His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. She went inside before either of them had to figure out what to do with that, and she ate Cora's breakfast at the kitchen table. And she thought about that evening, and she thought about the layout of Silas Marlowe's house in the dark, and she thought about what she was going to say when she walked back through that door. Miriam Holt found her there, still at the table, working through it. "You're going back," Miriam said. "Not a question. Tonight." Miriam sat down across from her. She looked at Tessa with the measuring expression of a woman who had evaluated a lot of difficult situations. "You know what he'll say when he sees you." "Yes. He'll say you came back because you knew nobody else would have you."
"Yes."
"And you'll let him say it." "I'll let him say it. And I'll watch his face when he says it, and I'll let him believe it." Tessa wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Because the moment he believes it, he stops watching me carefully enough." Miriam was quiet. "My husband believed that too," she said finally. "That nobody would fight back, because nobody had anything to fight back with." She looked at the table. "He was talking about Silas, but I've thought about it since, and I wonder if he was also talking about me." Tessa looked at her. "He had you," Tessa said. "You filed those complaints 3 times, and they went nowhere." "They went into that ledger," Tessa said, "which is now in my room upstairs, which is going to Harlan Crow in Cheyenne." She met Miriam's eyes. "They didn't go nowhere. They just took 7 years to get where they were going." Miriam held her gaze for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over Tessa's, not saying anything, just there. Tessa looked down at the 2 hands on the coffee cup, and something tightened in her chest, and she didn't look up until she was sure her face was steady again. Outside, the wind had started up, pushing cold air down the main street of Red Hollow and rattling the boarding house windows. It wasn't a storm, just winter doing its ordinary work. Tessa finished her coffee. She had 8 hours before dark. She used every one of them. She spent the 8 hours doing 3 things. The first was practical. She sat with Agnes Keel's husband, Harold, in the dry goods storeroom for 90 minutes while he spread his copied records across a crate and walked her through what he had. Harold Keel was a small, precise man in his late 50s who had the permanent look of someone braced for a consequence he'd been expecting for 6 years. His hands shook slightly when he handled the papers, but his memory was clear and his filing was meticulous. He had the trained habits of a man who had understood, even then, that what he was looking at was dangerous, and had preserved it the way you preserved evidence, without quite letting yourself call it that. What he had was not the correspondence itself. It was the other side of the correspondence, Silas's internal accounting for payments made, written in a ledger code that Harold had partially decoded before he'd quit, and which mapped almost exactly onto the dates of Judge Calder's favorable rulings across 11 years. This Tessa said, holding one page carefully. Combined with the Calder letters in the study, this is what makes it airtight. If you can get the letters, Harold said. I can get the letters. He looked at her. At the bruise on her face, which had turned the particular yellowish purple of the second day. Mrs. Marlowe, I want you to understand something. Quit that job, because I was afraid. I've been afraid ever since. I've let that fear sit in me for 6 years, and I've told myself it was protecting my wife, and it was. He stopped. His jaw worked. But it was also just fear, so he gathered his papers together. You take what you need from this. I'll testify to what I know. Tessa looked at him. Thank you, Harold. Don't thank me, he said, an echo of Cora. Just make it count. The second thing she did was write. She took 2 hours in her room at the boarding house, with paper Cora provided, and wrote out a full account, everything she knew, everything she'd seen, the sequence of events from the moment she'd found the false bottom in Silas's drawer to the morning she'd left. She wrote it in the same compact, dated, specific style she'd used for the ledger summary, and she signed it, and she gave one copy to Cora and one copy to Miriam Holt, with instructions that if she didn't come back from the Marlowe ranch, those copies were to be sent directly to Harlan Crow in Cheyenne without waiting for anything else. Miriam read the instructions and said nothing for a moment. Then she folded the paper and put it in her dress. You'll come back, she said. Probably, Tessa said. That's a terrible answer. Ronan said the same thing. Miriam looked at her. He's a good man. I'm starting to think so. He's been carrying that thing about his father's ranch for a long time, Miriam said. 7 years is a long time to carry something. Tessa thought about the way Ronan had said it flat, contained, the emotion pressed down into the facts, because the facts were the only part he'd let himself keep. The name, the amount, the 6 days. I know, she said. The third thing she did was rest. Not sleep, she couldn't sleep. But she lay on the bed in Cora's spare room and made herself stay still for an hour, made herself breathe slowly, and let her body do what it needed to do to be ready. And she thought through the layout of Silas's house, the way she'd been thinking through it since the idea had formed. The study was on the ground floor, off the main hallway, second door on the left. The locked box was in the lower cabinet behind the desk, behind a false panel that she'd found by accident 8 months ago when she'd been looking for a ruler and the panel had swung loose. She'd closed it and said nothing and filed the information away without entirely knowing why, which she now recognized as the same instinct Harold Keel had followed with his copies. Instinct of someone who lived in a dangerous place and kept a quiet inventory of what might someday matter. The key to the box she didn't have, but she knew where Silas kept his keys. He kept them on a ring in his jacket pocket during the day, and on the bedside table at night, and he kept them there because he had never once considered that anyone in his house would touch them. She was going to have to wait until he slept. She was going to have to be still in that house for however many hours it took, performing whatever performance he required, until he went to bed and she could move. She thought about that. She thought about his face when she walked back through the door. She pressed her hands flat on the bed beside her, felt the rough wool of the blanket, and breathed. Ronan was waiting at the edge of the South Road when she came out of the boarding house at 8 o'clock. He had 2 horses. He'd thought of that without being asked, which she noticed. He looked at her when she came down the steps, at her face and her posture, and whatever else he read when he looked at people, which was apparently more than most men bothered to. You've decided, he said, an hour ago. He nodded. They rode south without talking much. The road was clear and cold, and the stars were out, the kind of Wyoming sky that would have been beautiful if either of them had been in the state of mind to look at it. About a mile from the Marlowe ranch, Ronan stopped his horse. Cottonwood's on the west side of the yard, he said. I'll be there. If I'm not out by 3, I'll come in. Don't come in earlier than that, even if it looks like something's wrong. If you come early, he'll know you're close, and then he'll know we planned this. Ronan looked at her. 3, he said. Not a minute more. 3, she agreed. She started to ride. Tessa. She stopped. Ronan sat on his horse in the dark, and he had that quality he sometimes had, like he was trying to decide whether to say the thing he'd started to say or put it back. He said it. You told me this morning you wanted to hear the rest of that sentence. She waited. When this is over, he said, I'd like you to still be here, in the territory. That's all. She looked at him. In the dark, she couldn't read his face precisely. She'd gotten better, in 3 days, at reading the space around what Ronan said, shape of what he meant when words weren't quite enough. "I'll be here," she said. She rode toward the Marlowe ranch. The house was lit. That was her first read of the situation. As she came up the long approach, the windows on the ground floor were burning, which meant Silas was awake, which meant he was waiting. She had expected that. She had also expected the 2 men she could see at the corners of the yard, stationed like bad approximations of casual, which meant Silas was not as calm as he would want to appear. Good. A frightened man was predictable. A calm man was dangerous. She came up the approach slowly, her horse at a walk, her posture deliberately uncertain, shoulders slightly inward, hands loose on the reins. Not performing collapse. Just performing the particular quality of a woman who had thought about her options and run out of them. The door opened before she reached the porch. Silas stood in the frame. He was dressed not for bed, not for work. Just dressed, the way he always was, like he managed himself as a continuous presentation. He had a glass in his hand that was not his first of the evening, which she could tell from the particular stillness he had when he'd been drinking. Not loose, tighter. He looked at her. She looked back. She thought about what he needed to see, and she let her face do that work. And she hated every second of it, and she did it anyway. "Tessa," he said. "Silas." She dismounted. Her hands were steady. She didn't let herself think about Ronan in the cottonwoods, or the ledger in Miriam Holt's keeping, or the 3 hours she needed to move through. She thought only about this porch, this step. She walked up it. "You came back," he said. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." She said it flatly, like a woman who had exhausted herself arriving at a conclusion she didn't want. "Wherever I went, your people were going to find me. You were going to get a writ. I'd be brought back anyway, and it would look worse." He studied her. She held still. The calculation in his face was visible if you knew how to read it, and after 2 years she knew exactly how to read it. He was checking her story against his model of her against the woman he'd constructed through 2 years of patient erosion, and he was looking for places where it didn't fit. "And the cowboy," he said. She let something cross her face that was close enough to embarrassment to function as it. "He was trying to use me," she said. "I understood that once I'd slept and could think clearly. He wanted me to help him make trouble for you. I wasn't going to be his instrument." Silas was quiet. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." The house was exactly as she remembered it. That was the thing about houses you'd been afraid in. They didn't change when you were gone. The same wide hallway, the same lamplight on the same floors. The study door, second on the left, closed. The staircase to the bedroom at the end of the hall. Everything in its position, waiting. Silas poured her a glass of water she hadn't asked for and set it on the parlor table. He didn't sit. She didn't either. He moved around the perimeter of the room with the glass in his hand, not pacing nothing as obvious as pacing just that slow orbit he did when he was processing something. She had watched him do it for 2 years. It used to make her afraid because she couldn't read what came out of it. She was reading it now. "That man put ideas in your head," Silas said. "He tried to," she said. "He told me you'd done wrong by people. Showed me some papers. I don't know where he got them from." "What papers?" She shook her head. "I didn't understand them." "Land records of some kind," he said. "They proved you'd cheated families." She looked at Silas with something that was calibrated to be close to tired loyalty. "I told him that was between you and whoever was complaining and wasn't my concern." Silas looked at her. She looked back and let him look. "You shouldn't have run," he said. "I know. You frightened me." That one almost broke her performance. The particular shape of the lie, the idea of Silas Marlowe frightened, as though she were the one who held power in this architecture, almost made something show on her face. She pressed it down. "I was upset," she said. The things he was saying. "What things?" She let her eyes go to the floor. "That nobody would believe me if I spoke up for you. That people in town already thought you were." She stopped, like she was protecting him. "I got frightened and I ran and I was wrong to." The room was quiet. Silas set his glass down. "You're tired," he said. "Very. Go up to bed. We'll talk in the morning when you've rested." She nodded, moved toward the stairs, got her hand on the banister. "Tessa." She turned. He was looking at her across the room. In the lamplight, with the particular evenness of his face that she had once mistaken for steadiness, and now understood, was simply the absence of whatever most people felt. "I'm glad you came back," he said. She made her face do what it needed to do. "So am I," she said. She went upstairs. She sat on the bed in the dark for 40 minutes. She needed him asleep. She needed the house to go quiet. She needed every board in every hallway to be her ally, and the lamplight downstairs to go dark, and the two men she'd seen in the yard to be where she expected them, which was the front corners, not the back, because Silas never worried about the back. He was a man who watched entrances, not interiors. She listened. She heard him moving downstairs, the clink of a glass being set in the kitchen, the soft sound of the study door opening and then closing. She went tense. 10 minutes, the study door opened again. His footsteps came down the hall and started up the stairs. She lay down fast and arranged herself and closed her eyes and controlled her breathing. And she heard him open the bedroom door, stand in the frame for a moment, and then close it again. His footsteps moved past, to the room at the end, not the shared bedroom. His own room where he'd slept since the first time she hadn't cried the way he'd expected when he hit her and he'd decided something about her had changed. She waited another 30 minutes. The house went completely silent. She sat up. The key ring was on his bedside table, in his room at the end of the hall. She'd need to get in and out without waking him. The door to his room had a loose hinge, she knew that, had known it for a year, had never been the one to oil it because it was his room and she was not welcome to be in it, which meant the hinge had stayed loose, which meant she had to open the door at a specific angle and specific speed. She stood up. She crossed to the bedroom door in her stockinged feet and opened it 4 inches, the same 4 inches she'd measured 6 months ago when she'd opened it by mistake, reaching for the linen closet. The hinge said nothing. She moved into the hallway. The hall was dark except for the faint glow from the front windows where the moonlight came in. She knew this dark. She'd walked it for 2 years. She went to his door, 3 seconds with the hinge, angle, and speed exactly right. She moved inside. He was asleep. The specific quality of his breathing, a little heavy, not quite a snore, told her he'd had enough of his drink to go down solid. She stood still for 10 seconds and made sure. The key ring was on the table. She crossed to it. She lifted it with 2 fingers and pressed it against her palm to kill any sound and backed out of the room in 11 steps, the same 11 she'd counted getting in. And she managed the hinge from the outside and stood in the hall with his keys pressed flat in her hand and her heart running so hard she could feel it in her ears. She stood there, breathed. Then she went downstairs. The study smelled like him, wood oil and tobacco and paper, and she didn't let herself react to that smell, just moved straight to the desk and around to the back and found the lower cabinet by touch because she didn't dare use a lamp. The false panel was where it had always been. She pressed the lower right corner. It swung open. The box was there. She felt across the key ring by shape, the way she'd planned. Silas organized his keys by use. The household keys on the left side of the ring. The lockbox key had a different texture, more square at the top than round. She found it on the 3rd try. The box opened. She reached in. Letters. A stack of them, tied with cord. She could feel the quantity, and it was more than she'd hoped. 20, maybe 25 individual letters in that stack. She lifted them out. Underneath the letters was a second item she hadn't expected. A small bound notebook. She didn't have time to read it. She put both items inside her dress, against her body, the way she'd carried the ledger, and she closed the box, locked it, replaced it in the cabinet, closed the false panel, and stood up. She was putting the key ring in her pocket to carry it upstairs when she heard it. A floorboard. Not hers, she went completely still. A floorboard from the doorway side of the room, between her and the hall. In the dark, she could not see him, but she could hear the quality of the room change the way it changed when a body entered it. Then the lamp came on. Silas stood in the doorway with a lit lamp in one hand, and he looked at her across the study, and his face had none of the performance he'd worn all evening. None of the tired husband, none of the careful patience, just his real face. "I knew," he said, "the moment you came up the drive." She didn't move. "I've known you for 2 years, Tessa. I know when you're performing. He set the lamp on the shelf and came 2 steps into the room. "Give me back my keys." Her hand was in her pocket. On the key ring, she thought about the box already locked and replaced, about the letters and the notebook already inside her dress, about 3 o'clock, which was a long way away, and Ronan in the cottonwoods, which was outside. She was inside. Between her and outside was Silas and at least 2 men in the yard. She had about 4 seconds to decide what kind of woman she was going to be in those 4 seconds. She gave him the key ring. He took it, looked at it. His eyes went to the cabinet. "What did you take?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was looking. I couldn't find the key that fit." He crossed to the cabinet. She watched him check the panel, watched him press the corner, watched the panel swing open, and watched him look at the box, which was locked, and fit his key and open it. He stared into it for 5 full seconds. Then he closed it slowly and stood up. He turned around. "You're better at this than I gave you credit for," he said. "Silas." He crossed the room fast. His hand closed around her wrist, and he pulled her toward him, and she didn't scream. She was thinking too hard to scream. She was thinking about the angle of the door and the hallway and the back of the house, and how fast she could actually move versus how fast he could catch her. "Whatever you took," he said, very quiet, very close. "It doesn't leave this house. Let go of my arm." "Or what?" He said it without cruelty. "Just factual. You'll call for your cowboy? He's 3 miles away." She looked at him. For a moment, just a moment, the mask she'd worn all evening fell completely off. Not by choice, but because she couldn't hold it and do what she needed to do at the same time. And what he saw on her face wasn't fear. She saw him register that. "You're not frightened," he said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard from him before. Not anger, something closer to confusion. "Let go of my arm, Silas. You came back here. You came back for something. Let go." He grabbed her other arm and she moved. Not backward, forward, into him, which he hadn't expected, which threw his balance for exactly the half-second she needed. And she drove her elbow into his forearm and broke the grip, and she was out of the study and into the hallway and running. He shouted, not her name, just a shout, the sharp sound of a man whose control has slipped, and she heard it hit the walls of the hallway, and she didn't slow. She went for the back of the house, not the front door, not the main yard where the 2 men were stationed. She'd been planning a back route since she'd walked through that door along the kitchen, through the mudroom, out the side door that opened onto the kitchen garden, and then the fence at the south end of the garden that she had walked past 1,000 times and knew had a gap in the 3rd rail that she'd never told Silas about. She hit the mudroom door, it opened. She hit the side door. It stuck. Behind her, she could hear him coming down the hall, and a door opening somewhere above, not Silas. One of his men, someone had been in the house, and she hit the side door with her shoulder, and it gave with a sound like something tearing. And then she was outside. Cold, clear sky, moonlight on the kitchen garden, she ran. The gap in the fence was where it had always been. She went through it sideways, felt it catch on her dress, and heard the fabric tear, and didn't stop. On the other side of the fence was the empty ground between the ranch yard and the road, and then the cottonwoods. She could hear shouting behind her, now Silas in the yard, calling to his men, and the particular organized sound of men who knew what they were supposed to do when something went wrong. She ran harder. Her lungs burned. Her dress was torn and catching at her ankles, and she grabbed a fistful of it and held it up, and she thought about Ronan's voice, "Don't make me come before 3. And she thought, "It is not 3. And she thought, "I am going to be so angry if I die out here before I get to finish this." The cottonwoods were 40 yards ahead, then 30. Then she heard the horse, not from behind, from the left, from the dark edge of the tree line, the specific sound of a horse that had been standing still for a long time and had just been given a signal. Ronan came out of the cottonwoods at a run, not cantering, running, his horse, flat out across the open ground between them. She didn't slow down. She stretched her arm out. He leaned from the saddle and caught her hand, her wrist, really, the full grip of his hand around her wrist, and for one instant she was off the ground completely, her feet leaving the earth as his momentum and her momentum combined into something she couldn't control. And then she was up, half across the saddle, and her free hand grabbed his coat, and she pulled herself upright, and he was already turning the horse before she had both legs settled. His men came through the fence gap 30 seconds later. They were not fast enough. Ronan pushed the horse into the tree line and threw it, and the branches closed behind them, and the sound of the pursuit grew ragged as it hit the dark and the unfamiliar ground. And Ronan knew these trees in the dark the same way Tessa had known the hallways of that house. They ran for 3 minutes at speed. Then he slowed. Then stopped. Total quiet around them, except for the horse breathing hard and the sound of their own breath, and somewhere distant, faint, the sound of men who had lost them. Ronan looked at her. She was still gripping his coat. She made herself let go. "You all right?" he said. She thought about the answer. Her ribs hurt from the fence. Her wrist was going to have his handprint on it for a week. Her dress was torn in 2 places, and she had mud on her hands, and her heart was doing something that couldn't be described as a normal rhythm. "I have them," she said. He stared at her, the letters. The notebook. She pressed a hand against her ribs, against the flat shapes beneath her dress. "I have them. He opened the box while I was still in the room, and they were already gone." Ronan kept staring at her. "He was already in the doorway before I found them," she said. "He knew I'd come back. I had to move fast." "I heard the shout," he said. "I almost came in. I'm glad you didn't." "How close was it?" She thought about his hand on her wrist. The 4 seconds. The elbow. "Close enough," she said. "Not too close." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark of the cottonwoods, and she could hear his breathing slowing from where it had been, which told her he'd been more afraid than he'd let on, which told her something she stored away carefully. "The ledger," he said. "With Miriam. Safe." And he nodded toward her ribs. "Calder correspondence," she said. "And something else I didn't expect. A notebook I didn't have time to read." She pressed her hand against it again. "I think it might be worse than the ledger." He held her gaze. "We ride to Garrett's Crossing," he said. "Tonight. Right now. We don't wait for morning. Hastings. We wake him up." His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. "Silas knows you have something. He's going to move faster now. We have to move faster." She nodded. She was suddenly aware of how cold it was. Fear had been keeping her warm, and it was starting to ebb, and the cold was coming in behind it. Her hands were shaking. Not badly, but visibly. Ronan pulled his coat off without a word and put it around her. She started to say she was fine. She stopped. "Thank you," she said instead. He didn't respond to that, just turned the horse south and started riding. And she held on, and behind them the Marlowe ranch was lit up like something furious. And somewhere in that lit house, Silas Marlowe was learning for the first time in 15 years what it felt like to be one step behind. The notebook, as it turned out, when she finally read it in Burl Hastings's lamplight at 2 a.m, was not just the Calder correspondence. It was a record of every payment Silas had made to officials across 3 counties for 11 years in Silas's own hand, dated and signed with the initials of the recipients. Hastings read the first 10 pages and then set it down and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "Lord Almighty," he said. "Don't show me that to Judge Calder," Tessa said. Hastings almost laughed. Mrs. Marlowe," he said, "with what you've just put on my table, Judge Calder is the least of Silas Marlowe's problems." Outside Hastings's window, Garrett's Crossing was dark and quiet, and entirely unaware that in a small lamplit office, a woman who had been told for 2 years she was nothing was sitting at a table with the evidence that could dismantle an empire. Ronan sat across from her. He looked tired. So did she. Neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was the particular silence of 2 people who had come through something together and were still working out what to do with that fact. Hastings was already writing. His writer would leave for Cheyenne at first light. And Silas Marlowe, back at his ranch, was making his own calculations, calling in every debt, pressing every contact, preparing every defense, and he was preparing them, for the first time, not against a frightened woman with nowhere to go, but against a woman who had walked back into his house, looked him in the face, and taken exactly what she'd come for. Hastings's rider left for Cheyenne at 4:30 in the morning. Tessa watched him go from the window of Hastings' office, a young man on a good horse, disappearing into the pre-dawn dark with a sealed document case strapped to his saddle, and she felt something she couldn't quite name. not relief. Relief was too simple, more like the particular feeling of having released something you'd been holding so long your hands had forgotten what open felt like. Ronan was asleep in the chair behind her. He'd gone under about an hour ago, which she'd noticed because the quality of the room had changed. The particular alertness he carried, even when he was still, had simply dropped. And she'd looked over, and he was out, his chin at an angle that was going to give him a stiff neck, his hands loose in his lap. She hadn't woken him. She'd sat with the notebook in her lap and the letters stacked on the table beside her and read everything twice more in Hastings's lamplight, building the sequence in her head the way she built all sequences chronologically, cross-referenced, each payment mapped to its corresponding ruling or favor. The notebook was thorough in the way that only a careful, arrogant man's records were thorough. Silas had written it like it was never going to be read by anyone except himself, which meant he'd written it honestly. Amounts, initials, dates, brief notations of what each payment had purchased. His handwriting was small and controlled and utterly legible because Silas Marlowe had always believed his records were safe, which meant he'd never had reason to obscure them. That belief had just destroyed him. She set the notebook down when the writer was out of sight. Hastings had gone back to bed 2 hours ago, after she'd walked him through the most significant sections and watched the color gradually leave his face. He was a careful man retired from territorial land work, cautious by professional habit, and he'd asked good questions and not tried to minimize what he was looking at, which meant he understood it. He'd said he would write to 2 other land agents he trusted, both in different counties, to begin the process of verifying the property transfers from the ledger independently. "You're building a wall around it," Tessa had said. "A wall that even Silas Marlowe's attorney can't knock down," he'd confirmed. She turned from the window. Ronan shifted in the chair without waking. She looked at him for a moment at the lines of his face in sleep, which were the same lines when he was awake but less guarded, just features now instead of a controlled expression. He was not a handsome man in the conventional sense. He was the kind of man whose face made more sense the longer you looked at it. She sat back down at the table. She thought about what came next. Crow needed a week to receive Hastings's rider, another day or 2 to review. Then travel time. At minimum 10 days before anything moved officially, and that was if Crow took it seriously immediately, which Hastings believed. Crow had a reputation for not being buyable, which in this territory meant something. 10 days in which Silas knew someone was coming for him. 10 days in which he would do what cornered, careful men did. She made a list in her head of what he would try. He would try to discredit her first. That was always first, because it was cheapest, and he was good at it. He would expand the story he'd already started: the unstable wife, the grudge-holding cowboy, and he would add to it, because adding to a story was easier than retracting one, and the version of Tessa Marlowe he had been presenting to Red Hollow for 2 years was already shaped to receive those additions. He would go after Ronan directly, second, some legal mechanism, a debt, a violation, a manufactured claim. Something designed to tie up Ronan's attention and resources and separate him from Tessa. Third, if the first 2 failed, he would try to get to the evidence itself, either through Hastings, which would be difficult. Hastings had already sent the primary documents out, or through Tessa, which was the thing that kept her sitting awake in the dark at 4 in the morning instead of sleeping like Ronan. She was the evidence in a way that couldn't be copied and sent to Cheyenne. She was the person who had read the ledger, who had reconstructed it from memory, who could stand in a room and answer questions about it for 2 hours without notes. Silas knew that. He had spent 2 years being married to her memory and her precision, and he understood now what that meant turned against him. She heard Ronan shift again. "You should sleep," he said. His voice was rough. "I thought you were asleep." "I was. Now I'm not." He straightened in the chair, moving his neck experimentally. He was going to have that stiff neck. "You've been running that list in your head for an hour." "What list?" "Whatever list you've been building." He looked at her. "I can hear you think sometimes. There's a quality the air gets." She considered that. "Silas is going to move against us in the next 10 days, she said. "Yes. He'll try to discredit me first. He's already started," Ronan said. "What comes after that?" "You." She watched his face. "He'll find something to use against you. A debt, a legal claim. Something real enough to require your attention." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "There's a grazing rights dispute on my eastern boundary," he said. "Been unresolved for 2 years. The claim belongs to a rancher named Fuller, who I've always suspected wasn't acting entirely on his own." Tessa looked at him. "Fuller is on page 78 of the ledger," she said. "Silas paid him $40 in April of '85. The notation says Eastern Buffer." Ronan's jaw went tight. "He ceded it," he said, 2 years ago. "He planned ahead for needing leverage against me. He plans ahead for everything." She laced her fingers together on the table. "Which means the grazing dispute is already in position. He won't need to create it. He just needs to activate it. How does that work legally? Fuller files a formal claim with the county office. Judge Calder rules in his favor. Your cattle are off the eastern pasture, and you're in the middle of a legal dispute that requires your physical presence in town for hearings, and you're separated from me, and whatever happens to me in that window is no longer your immediate concern because you've got your own fire to put out." Ronan stood up. He walked to the window and stood where she'd stood earlier, looking out at the dark main street of Garrett's Crossing. "How much time do we have before he activates it?" he said. "If he went directly from last night's failure to his next move, Fuller files by end of week." She paused. "Maybe sooner. Then we need to expose Calder before that filing goes through." "The notebook does that," she said. "But the notebook is in Cheyenne. Copy of the relevant pages could be challenged as incomplete." She shook her head. "We need Crow here with authority before Calder can rule on anything Silas pushes through. Which means we need 10 days where Silas can't land a clean hit." Ronan turned from the window. "What does 10 days require?" he said. It was the same question he'd asked about the plant 3 days ago. "Just the options. No editorializing," she told him. It required, first, visibility. She needed to be seen in Red Hollow, not hiding, not defended, not obviously under anyone's protection. A woman hiding looked like a woman with something to hide. A woman going about her business in the town square while her husband tried to destroy her was considerably harder to paint as unstable. It required, second, witnesses to everything. Every conversation Silas had about her. Every claim his attorney made. Every time Pike moved in her direction. She needed people watching and people willing to say what they'd seen, and she had Miriam Holt and Patience Garver and Agnes Keel, which was not many but was enough if they were strategic about it. Third, it required Harold Keel's records to be in the hands of someone Silas couldn't reach. Not Hastings, who was already in the chain. Someone lateral. Someone who could hold them independently. "There's a newspaper editor in Laramie," Ronan said. "Man named Aldous Webb. He's run 2 stories on territorial land fraud in the last 5 years. Neither of them touched Silas directly, but I know he's tried." Tessa looked at him. "You know him?" "We've corresponded. He tried to investigate my father's foreclosure in '80. Couldn't get enough to print, but he kept the research. If we send him Harold's records, he can't print until there's an indictment. But he can hold them, and Silas knows it." Ronan paused. "Silas has people in a lot of places. He does not have people at the Laramie paper. He and Webb have been circling each other for 5 years." She thought about that. A newspaper editor holding corroborating records as a lateral source even if Silas gets to Hastings, even if something happens to the documents in Cheyenne. "There's still Webb," Ronan said. She nodded. "We need to get Harold's copies to Laramie by tomorrow." "I'll ride tonight," Ronan said. "You just woke up. I've ridden longer on less sleep." He looked at her steadily. "You go back to Red Hollow. You stay visible. You let them see you're not frightened." "I'm not frightened," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "That's why it's going to work." She arrived back in Red Hollow before noon. Cora Finch took one look at the torn dress and the mud and the general state of Tessa Marlowe and said nothing, which was one of the things Tessa had come to appreciate deeply about Cora in the span of 4 days. She gave Tessa clean clothes and hot water and let her have an hour. Then Miriam Holt arrived, and then Patience Garver, and the 4 of them sat in Cora's kitchen, and Tessa told them what had happened and what was coming. Miriam's face went through several things while she listened. By the end, it had settled into something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but had elements of both the expression of a woman who had spent 7 years knowing something was wrong and now had a name for all of it. "He rerouted my complaints," she said. It wasn't the first time she'd said it, but each time it came out slightly different. like she was still fitting the shape of it in her mouth, 3 separate times, and Calder just returned them. Calder's name is in the notebook 17 times, Tessa said. The amounts are specific. The dates match his rulings. Is there anything connecting him to my husband's land specifically? There's a ruling dated January of '82 that Silas's notation identifies as the Holt Eastern Boundary Decision. The payment to Calder is dated 2 weeks prior. Miriam was quiet. She pressed her hands flat on the table. What do you need from me for the next 10 days, she said. Presents, Tessa said. Yours and yours. She looked at patience whenever you can manage it. If I'm in public and Silas's people are watching, I need it to be clear that I have people who will say what they saw. Witnesses, Patience said. Not in a legal sense yet. Just eyes. People who are watching and who Silas knows are watching. Patience nodded. I can do that. She paused. My neighbor, a man named Cole Dre, his family lost land to Silas in '83. He's a large man. He has a particular quality about him that tends to discourage certain kinds of behavior. She looked at Tessa carefully. I'm saying he would be willing to simply be present, if that would help. Tessa thought about Pike and his deputies and the particular mathematics of men who did ugly work and reconsidered when the odds shifted. Yes, she said, that would help. The first move came the following day, not from Pike, which was what she'd expected. From Silas's attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had an office on the south end of Main Street, and who appeared at the boarding house in the mid-morning with a document in his hand and the particular expression of someone performing regret. Cora answered the door. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Marlowe, Pruitt said. She's not available, Cora said. It's a legal matter. Then come back with a marshal, Cora said, and closed the door. She came upstairs and told Tessa, who was sitting at the window because she'd been watching Main Street since breakfast. What did he have? Tessa said. Looked like a petition of some kind. Incompetency petition. Tessa had been expecting this one too. It's a legal mechanism. He petitions the court that I'm not of sound mind, which, if granted, gives him control over my person and my decisions pending a hearing. It requires Calder's signature. Cora looked at her. Can he do that? Calder will sign anything, Silas asks. She paused. But a petition like that requires a medical examination. An independent physician has to sign the finding. She turned from the window. Who is the doctor in Red Hollow? Benjamin Marsh. He's been here 12 years. Is he Silas's man? Cora considered. I don't know, she said honestly. He's never been in anyone's pocket that I've seen. But he's also never had a reason to stand against Silas. Get me a meeting with him this afternoon, Tessa said. Before Pruitt gets to him, she was in Benjamin Marsh's examination room by 2 o'clock. He was a compact, gray-bearded man in his 50s who looked at her across his desk with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read bodies and faces as professional practice. He looked at the bruise on her face, which was now fully expressed yellowing at the edges, still dark at the center, with an expression that he controlled very professionally. Mrs. Marlowe, he said. Dr. Marsh, she sat straight. I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you quickly, because I believe Gerald Pruitt is going to visit you within the next 48 hours with a petition for an incompetency finding that requires your signature. He looked at her. I'm going to ask you to hear me out before you make any decisions about that petition, she said. And then I'm going to ask you to look at my face and tell me who in this room appears to have a problem with their judgment. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Go ahead, he said. She talked for 30 minutes. She didn't show him the ledger it was still with Miriam, but she told him what was in it. Specifically enough that he could verify the names against his own knowledge of the basin and its history. She told him about the notebook. She told him about Harlan Crow and the rider to Cheyenne and Burl Hastings and Aldous Webb in Laramie. She gave him names and dates and amounts the way she always did, and she watched his face while she did it. Was a doctor. He knew how to listen without showing everything he was thinking. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The bruise on your face, he said finally. Silas, the morning before I ran. Has this happened before? Not leaving marks that required a physician. Yes, otherwise. He looked down at his desk. I have a patient, he said slowly. An older man, a rancher, who came to me 2 years ago with a broken rib. He told me he'd fallen from a horse. He was not the kind of man who fell from horses. He paused. His property borders what is now the Marlowe Western Range. She waited. I signed a competency declaration for Judge Calder 6 months ago, he said, for a widow named Sears. I was told it was a routine estate matter. The declaration was used, I later learned, to remove her legal standing to contest a property transfer. He looked up. I was used, I know, she said quietly. Mrs. Sears is in the ledger. He pressed his fingers to his mouth. If Pruitt comes to me with a petition, he said. You don't have to tell me now, Tessa said. I'm asking you to wait before you sign anything. That's all. Just wait. And if Crow doesn't come, then you've waited a week and lost nothing. She met his eyes. But if Crow comes and you've already signed Pruitt's petition, your name is in the record of the proceedings whether you want it there or not. Marsh looked at his desk for a long moment. Come back tomorrow, he said. I want to look at the bruise properly and write up what I see. He paused. Medically. For the record. She understood what he was offering. Thank you, she said. Don't. He was the third person to say it. Just come back tomorrow. The grazing claim came on Thursday exactly as she'd predicted. Fuller filed with the county office in the morning, and by afternoon Calder had assigned it for a hearing the following week. Ronan received notice by a rider who arrived at the ranch. He was back from Laramie by then. The documents safely delivered to Webb, who had apparently received them with the focused intensity of a man who had been waiting 5 years for exactly this. And he rode into Red Hollow with the notice in his hand and a particular expression on his face that Tessa had learned. Meant he was angry and choosing to be calm about it. Fuller, he said. They were in Cora's sitting room, door closed. Expected, she said. The hearing is set for Tuesday. Calder's court? Calder's court. She shook her head. We can challenge the venue. Given the notebook, we have grounds to argue Calder has a conflict of interest on anything connected to Silas's operations. On what basis? That his name appears in documents currently under federal review. We don't need to prove it yet. We just need to file the challenge and create delay. She paused. Do you have a lawyer? Not in Red Hollow. Hastings knows a land attorney in Garrett's Crossings. I'll ride back tonight. Ronan. She put her hand on his arm briefly. You've ridden to Laramie and back in 3 days. Eat something first. He looked at her hand on his arm. She moved it. Eat something first, she said again. Then ride. He ate something. Then he rode. 10 days were not smooth. Pruitt came back with the incompetency petition on Friday, as she'd expected, and Marsh told him he needed more time to conduct a proper examination, which Pruitt accepted with bad grace but couldn't refuse, because a rushed medical finding would be challenged, and Silas needed this one to stick. That bought 4 days. On Saturday, someone threw a rock through the window of Cora's boarding house at 2 a.m. Nobody was hurt. Cora swept up the glass and replaced the window herself at dawn and told no one except Tessa and the deputy she filed a report with, whose name was not one of Pike's closest associates, which Tessa had researched specifically. The rock achieved nothing. On Sunday, Silas himself came to Red Hollow for the first time since this had started. He came without the performance of a worried husband. He came with his attorney and 2 other men who were dressed well enough to be from somewhere other than a ranch, which suggested Cheyenne money, or Cheyenne legal assistance, which suggested he'd heard something about Harlan Crow. He did not go to the boarding house. He went to the bank, and then to the county office, and then to Pruitt's office. He was in Red Hollow for 4 hours, and Tessa knew everywhere he went because Patience Garver's neighbor, Cole Dre, spent the afternoon walking along the same stretches of Main Street as Silas and reporting back, with the reliable, unhurried observation of a large, calm man doing his quiet work. He's scared, Dre told her that evening. Not with satisfaction. Just fact. Good, she said. Ronan came back Monday morning with a land attorney named Samuel Price who was small, precise, and had the rapid-fire mental quality of someone who found law genuinely interesting rather than professionally convenient. Price reviewed the Fuller filing and the relevant sections of the notebook Ronan had brought copies of the key pages, and by noon had drafted a venue challenge that cited federal review conflict in language tight enough that even Calder would need to find a reason to deny it. He'll find a reason, Tessa said. Of course he will, Price said. But finding a reason takes time. And when Crow arrives, every procedural delay we've created is evidence of obstruction. He looked at his draft with the expression of a craftsman reviewing his work. We're not trying to win in Calder's court. We're building a record of what Calder did. Tessa looked at him. You've done this before, she said. Once, Price said. In '83. Different county, different judge. Same architecture. He paused. That case took 2 years and the judge kept his position. But 3 families got their land back in the settlement. We want more than a settlement, Tessa said. Yes, Price said. You have more than I had in '83. He looked at the stack of documents on the table between them. Considerably more. Crow arrived on day 11. Not with fanfare. Not with a large party. Just 3 riders coming into Red Hollow on a Wednesday afternoon. The lead rider, a large, weathered man in his 50s who wore his authority the way weathered men wore things not displayed. Just present. Harlan Crow looked at Red Hollow the way a man looked at a place he'd been told about and was now verifying. His first stop was not the sheriff's office, not the county office, not Pruitt's or Calder's. He stopped at Cora Finch's boarding house. He asked for Tessa Marlowe. She was brought to him in the sitting room, and he stood when she came in, and he had the look of a man who had read a great deal of paper about her and was now adjusting it against the actual person. Marshal Crow, she said. Mrs. Marlowe. He shook her hand. Not a performance. Just a handshake. I've read the summary your people sent. I've read Hastings's letter. I reviewed the notebook and letters in Cheyenne. He sat. She sat. I'd like you to walk me through it again. In your own words, your own sequence. She started. She went for an hour and 40 minutes without stopping, from the false bottom in the drawer to the bruise, to the storm to Ronan's cabin, to the names on the ledger, to the meeting with the women in Cora's kitchen, to the notebook and the Calder payments and the rock through. The window and Silas's visit to the bank on Sunday. Crow made notes. He asked 7 questions, all precise, none of them tests. He was filling gaps, not doubting her. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. 11 families, he said, at minimum. There may be more I didn't have access to. The judge, 17 documented payments, dated, initialed the sheriff, 9 entries, smaller amounts more frequent. Crow closed his notebook. I'm going to need you to testify formally, he said. When I'm ready to move on Marlowe, which will be within the week, I need to establish the case before I approach him or the local authorities, because I expect the local authorities to warn him. He paused. That's not a question. That's a statement about what's going to happen. I know, she said. The testimony will be public. His attorney will attend. He will try to discredit me, she said. I know. It will be unpleasant. So was running 3 miles through a storm. She held his gaze. I'll testify. Crow looked at her for a moment. You're not what I expected, he said. Not unkindly. People keep saying that, she said. Ronan was outside when she came out. He was leaning against the boarding house wall with his arms crossed and his hat pulled down against the afternoon sun, and he straightened when he saw her face. How was he? He said. Serious. Good. He wants testimony within the week. Ronan nodded. How are you? He said. She thought about that honestly, which was something she'd started to do, give him real answers instead of the useful answers she'd been giving people for 2 years. Nervous, she said, about the testimony, not about whether to do it, just about standing up in a room and having Pruitt in front of me trying to take me apart. He can try, Ronan said. He's good at it. So are you. He said it flat, not to make her feel better, just stating what he had observed. I've watched you reconstruct documents from memory, walk back into the house of the man who hit you, and spend 11 days holding together a strategy that most people couldn't have managed in twice the time. Pruitt trying to take you apart is a different problem than the ones you've been solving, but it's not a harder one. She looked at him. You have more faith in me than I have in myself sometimes, she said. No, he said. I have exactly the right amount. You've been running below that for 2 years. She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked at the street for a moment. Crow's going to move on Silas by the end of the week, she said. Once he arrests him, the county office falls apart. Calder will refuse to sign anything, because signing things becomes evidence against him. The Fuller claim goes into suspension, my eastern pasture, Ronan said. Eventually returned. She paused, along with some others. He looked at the street, too. Miriam Holt's land, he said. If restitution proceedings go the way Crow indicated, yes. It won't be simple or fast. but yes, he was quiet. She looked at the side of his face, the jaw, the weathered lines, the thing behind his eyes that was always working. "Your father's property," she said quietly. "I know. Are you all right?" He was quiet for a moment longer than usual. "Ask me again when it's finished," he said. "I'm not sure what I am right now." She understood that. They stood on the street in the November afternoon, both of them in the particular suspended state of people who have done everything they can do and are now waiting for the machinery they've set in motion to complete its work. "The testimony," she said. "Yes, I need to prepare." "Then prepare." He looked at her. "And Tessa, I'll be in that room." She looked back. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." She nodded. Then she went back inside, and she sat at Cora's kitchen table, and she began to go through everything she knew, one more time from the beginning, building it into the shape it needed to be when she stood up in a packed room in Red Hollow and said it out loud, with Pruitt in front of her and Silas at the back, and 11 families worth of evidence in her head, and nowhere left to hide, and no more reason to. She was ready. She had been ready for 2 years without knowing it. She just hadn't had anyone willing to stand in a Wyoming storm and wait for her to figure that out. Courthouse in Red Hollow had not been built for crowds. It was a plain, practical building, 2 rooms, pine floors, windows that let in too much cold and not enough light, designed for the ordinary business of a small territory town. Deed registrations, minor disputes, the occasional drunk handled with paperwork. It had never been asked to hold what it was, being asked to hold on the Thursday morning when Tessa Marlowe walked through its front door. People were standing along the walls, more outside, visible through the windows, gathered on the street in the November cold, because there was no more room inside. Tessa counted faces as she walked to the front, not from nerves, just from habit, the same way she counted numbers, and she recognized most of them. Ranch hands, shop owners, wives of men who worked Silas's range, women who had sat near her at church socials 2 years ago and then watched her stop coming. She recognized the face of the widow Sears, whom Marsh had told her about. She recognized 3 men whose names she'd seen in the ledger. She recognized Patience Garver standing near the back with Cole Dre beside her, both of them still and watchful. She recognized Miriam Holt in the second row, sitting straight with her hands in her lap and 3 years of unanswered letters folded in her dress pocket. She did not look for Ronan. She knew he was there. Silas was at the defense table with Pruitt and the 2 men from Cheyenne she'd seen Sunday. He looked, and this surprised her, though it shouldn't have tired. Not broken. Silas Marlowe was not a man who broke visibly. Tired, and underneath the tiredness, the specific tight quality of a man who was very good at controlling situations and had been watching a situation escape his control for 2 weeks. He looked at her when she walked in. She looked back. She didn't look away first. She sat down at the table where Crow's deputy, a young man named Aldous, had set up the documentation. Crow himself sat to her left. Samuel Price, who had ridden back from Garrett's Crossing for this, sat to her right. Price had a folder of papers in front of him, and the focused, slightly remote expression he wore when he was simultaneously listening and running legal calculations. Crow leaned toward her. "How are you, ready?" she said. He nodded. That was enough. The federal magistrate Crow had brought from Cheyenne a lean man named Holloway, who had the air of someone who had presided over things considerably larger than this, and was giving it the same. Careful attention, regardless, called the room to order. And Tessa began. She had prepared for 2 days. She had sat at Cora's table and gone through every piece of information she carried, sorted it, sequenced it, and practiced the shape of it out loud until it moved through her naturally not memorized. Exactly, but worn in, the way a road gets worn. She had thought about what Pruitt would challenge and where he would push, and how Silas's version of Tessa Marlowe, the unstable, desperate, manipulated woman, would be deployed against her. And she had made her peace with the fact that she could not stop him from deploying it. She could only be so different from that version that the room could see the distance themselves. She testified for 1 hour and 53 minutes. She started with the drawer, the false bottom, the ledger in its oilskin, the 20 pages, and then the 40, and then the lamp burning low, and Silas's boots on the porch steps. She went through the names in order. Not because Holloway required order, he had the documents, but because she understood instinctively that a room full of people who had lived alongside these names for years needed to hear them spoken out loud, in sequence, by a woman who had been inside the house where their destruction had been planned. Thomas Vale. She said it the same way she said the others. Ronan, in the back of the room, made no sound. Miriam Holt's husband, Francis. She heard something shift in Miriam's row, the Ruiz family, the widow Sears. 7 other names that had been recorded in a locked box behind a false panel in a study that a man had never imagined his wife would dare to enter. She talked about the payments to Calder. She gave dates and amounts. She talked about the bribery records in the notebook, the initialed entries, the corresponding rulings, and she watched 3 members of the room who she suspected were connected to Calder's office go very still. She talked about the letters, about her own role in forwarding correspondence that she hadn't known was being intercepted, hadn't known for a year, had suspected for another, and had then begun quietly observing. She talked about the morning Silas hit her. She said it plainly. No performance of distress, just what happened. In the sequence it happened, and she watched the room receive it. Pruitt objected to 3 things during her testimony. Holloway sustained none of them. Then Pruitt got his cross-examination. He was good. She had known he would be good. He came at her from the angle she'd expected the unstable wife, the grudge, the cowboy with his own grievances against her husband, and he built it carefully, the way a good attorney built things, not through accusation but through implication, through the gentle accumulation of suggestions that each seemed reasonable and together were meant to leave a particular picture. He suggested her memory was unreliable. She gave him 3 consecutive series of figures from the ledger, unprompted, accurate to the cent, and invited him to check them against the authenticated copy. He suggested she'd had help constructing the narrative from Ronan Vale. She said, "Ronan Vale cannot read a financial ledger. I can. I've been able to since I was 12 years old. Would you like me to explain the debt acquisition mechanisms Silas used to take his father's ranch? I can do it without notes." Pruitt moved on. He suggested the notebook might have been fabricated or removed from context. Harold Keel, who had been listed as a witness and sat quietly in the 3rd row until this moment, stood up and said, "I can speak to the notebook's authenticity, if the magistrate would like. I kept parallel records from the same period for the same accounts." Holloway noted it and said he would hear from Keel next. Pruitt tried once more. He framed it carefully, in the language of concern rather than attack. He was worried about Mrs. Marlowe, really, about what she'd been through, about whether a woman in her emotional position could be considered a fully reliable source, and he said it with such practiced sympathy that it almost sounded genuine. Tessa looked at him. She waited for him to finish. Then she said, "Mr. Pruitt, I have given you 2 hours of specific, dated, cross-reference testimony that has been corroborated by authenticated documents, independent records, and witnesses with no connection to each other. I would like you to point to one specific fact I've stated that is inaccurate." Pruitt started to speak. "One specific fact," she said. "Not a suggestion about my state of mind, a fact." The room was quiet. Pruitt did not point to a fact. Holloway made a note. Harold Keel testified for 40 minutes. Miriam Holt testified for 25, producing her 3 original complaints, the physical letters, kept for 7 years, and matching them to the ledger entries Tessa had cited. Benjamin Marsh presented his medical documentation of Tessa's injury, signed and dated, describing the bruise on her face and his clinical assessment of its origin. Then Crow stood up and presented the summary of the federal investigation, which had been running formally since the documents arrived in Cheyenne, and which had in 10 days corroborated the core of the ledger through independent land record searches across 3 counties. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Holloway ordered Silas Marlowe taken into federal custody pending trial on charges of fraud, conspiracy, falsification of land records, and bribery of public officials. He ordered Orson Pike suspended from his position pending separate investigation. He issued a notice to Judge Calder that his rulings on any matter connected to Silas Marlowe's operations were under federal review. He froze the Marlowe estate assets, and he voided every outstanding legal action against Tessa Marlowe including the incompetency petition that Pruitt had finally filed 2 days ago, and that had been sitting on Calder's desk unsigned because Marsh had not signed the medical finding. Silas was standing when the marshals came to him. He didn't resist. He was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who calculated, and he was calculating now, already thinking about attorneys and appeals and what could be saved, and there was something almost worse about that than if he had raged. Because even now, even here, he was still managing, still trying to control the shape of the next thing. He passed Tessa's table on the way out. He looked at her. She had thought, in the weeks leading to this moment, about what she would feel when it happened. She had expected anger, or satisfaction, or the shaky relief of something ending. She had not expected what she actually felt, which was something simpler and harder to name the same feeling she'd had watching Hastings's rider disappear in the dark. Like she had set something down that she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten the weight of it until it was gone. She looked back at Silas. No fear, no shame, no apology for occupying the space she occupied. He was taken out. The room exhaled. It took a long time for the courthouse to empty, and she sat where she was while it did, because her legs were not entirely reliable, and she preferred to discover that privately. Price was talking to Crow. Aldous was organizing documents. Miriam Holt had stood and then sat back down and was doing something with her hands in her lap that Tessa recognized as the physical work of holding yourself together. Someone sat in the chair next to her. She looked Ronan. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, the way he did things without performance, without announcing it, just present. She looked at him for a moment. "How's your neck?" she said. He looked at her. "From the chair in Hastings's office," she said. "You slept at an angle. You've been moving your head carefully for 2 weeks." Something shifted in his expression. "It's fine. You should have woken me. You needed the sleep. You needed the chair. I've slept in worse places." He paused. "How are you?" She took stock. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. Something behind her sternum was doing something complicated that she hadn't quite sorted out. "I'm all right," she said. "You were—" He stopped. "Try it again. I've watched a lot of people try to hold something together under pressure. You were something else in there." "I was terrified," she said. "I know. You were still something else." She looked at the floor for a moment. "Thank you for being in that room," she said. "I told you I would be." "I know. I'm thanking you anyway." He nodded, accepted it, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't deflect compliments with false modesty or receive them with preening. He just took them and moved on. "What happens now?" he said. She had a list for that too, which probably surprised no one. "Restitution proceedings," she said. "They'll take months, maybe longer. Crow's office will run them, but each family will need to make a separate claim, and each claim will be reviewed. It won't be fast." "Miriam?" "Frances Holt's property is one of the cleaner cases. The documentation is complete, and her complaints establish a timeline of wrongful denial. Price thinks she has a strong position." Ronan nodded. "My father's land," he said. She looked at him. "Also a strong case," she said. "The acquisition method is documented, and the payment amount versus assessed value is the most extreme ratio here in the ledger, $218 against $4,200. Price called it an exemplary case of predatory acquisition. He'll want to use it as a primary example in the restitution argument." Ronan was quiet. She waited. "He died believing he'd lost it fair," he said finally. "The debt was real, and he just couldn't meet it. I couldn't tell him otherwise because I didn't know otherwise." He paused. He spent the last 2 years of his life thinking he'd failed. She held that with him for a moment. "He didn't fail," she said. "I know that now. The record will show that now. Formally, in writing." He looked at her. "Is that enough?" she said honestly. Because she actually wanted to know. He thought about it the same way she'd asked it honestly, not performing an answer. "It's something," he said. "I don't know yet if it's enough. Some things you carry, and the weight of them changes, but they don't get lighter exactly. They just become a different shape." She thought about 2 years of walking through rooms, trying not to take up space. About the particular way shame worked, how it didn't leave clean, how it left residue, how you kept discovering new corners of it months after you thought you'd swept the place out. "Yes," she said. "I know that." He looked at her with a directness that she'd stopped flinching from somewhere around the end of the first week. "What do you want?" he said. "After all of this is finished, what do you actually want?" Nobody had asked her that in a long time. Not as a real question. She considered it. "I want to stay," she said. "In the territory. I've been thinking about what I'd do, and there are families like the ones in that room today who don't understand the documents they're being asked to sign. Mortgages, deeds, grazing leases. Silas built his empire partly because people signed things without understanding what they were signing." She paused. "I understand those documents. I could help people understand them before they sign." Ronan listened. "It's not a grand plan," she said. "It sounds like exactly a grand plan. It's a small office and a knowledge of land law. That's how the useful things start," he said. She looked at him. "You said something," she said. 3 weeks ago, on the road to the Marlowe ranch. You said when this was over, you'd like me to still be here." "I remember." "I said I'd be here. You did. I'm here," she said. "That's what I wanted you to know. I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her in the clearing courthouse with the pine floors and the cold coming through the windows and the smell of winter in the air, and his face did the thing it rarely did, which was let her see most of what was behind it. "All right," he said. It was a simple answer for something complicated. She appreciated that about him. The winter that followed was not simple. The restitution proceedings moved at the speed of federal bureaucracy, which was slow and occasionally maddening and required Price's continued involvement and multiple trips to Cheyenne and a great deal of paper. Crow was thorough, which meant he was methodical, which meant nothing happened fast. Silas's trial was set for spring. His attorneys, he had 3 by December, filed motions and challenges and delays, because that was what attorneys did when the case against their client was airtight, and delay was the only weapon left. The trial got pushed to summer. Orson Pike was removed from office by February. The deputy who replaced him temporarily, a younger man named Greer, who had always done his job without Pike's particular alignment, was, according to Cora, actually competent, which Red Hollow hadn't experienced in a while. Judge Calder resigned quietly in January, before he could be formally charged, and moved to another state with his wife. Crow said this was less satisfying than a conviction, but occasionally what you got, and at least it cleared the county bench for someone honest. Tessa opened her documentation office in November, 2 weeks after the courthouse. It was a single room above the dry goods store, Harold Keel's store, that Harold offered at a rent she could afford, which was almost nothing, because Harold felt he owed her something, and she had learned to accept help without arguing herself out of it. She put a sign on the door. She told Cora and Miriam and Patience, and they told people, and within a month there was a regular line of families outside her door, with papers in their hands and worried faces. Mortgages that were unclear, lease agreements with buried provisions, deeds with boundary descriptions that didn't match what the family thought they owned. She sat with people for as long as they needed and explained what they were looking at and what it meant and what they should push back on before signing. She charged what people could pay. Some paid nothing, kept track, and didn't worry about it, because she had the financial settlement from the voiding of her marriage to Silas Crow's office, had untangled that during the asset freeze, and what came back to her was not enormous but was enough, and the office was not about money anyway. It was about the thing she'd understood sitting in Hastings's lamplight with the notebook, that most of what Silas had taken hadn't been possible without people who didn't understand the paper in front of them. Change the paper knowledge, you change the mathematics. Ronan came by the office sometimes. Not often, not in a way that announced itself. He would appear in the doorway when she'd finished with her last appointment of the day, and she would look up and he would be there, and they would close up together and walk somewhere, or ride out to his ranch and work through whatever needed working through. They were not simple together. She had too many opinions, and he had too much silence. And sometimes those things grated against each other in ways that took time to resolve. She would get frustrated with what she called his retreat, the way he sometimes went into himself when things got difficult, and he would get frustrated with what he called her calculation, the way she sometimes processed difficult things by, making lists when what he needed was just to sit with them unresolved. They were not simple, but they were honest with each other, and that turned out to be worth considerably more than simple. She learned that he'd been carrying his father's death for 7 years as a personal failure. The way people who can't fix things sometimes carry the unfixed thing as proof of their inadequacy. She told him that, directly, because she had learned that Ronan did better with direct than with careful, and she watched him receive it the way he received most hard truths, quietly, without disputing it, letting it sit until he'd worked through whether it was accurate. He told her, one evening in February with the stove going and snow against the cabin windows, that he had spent most of his adult life assuming he was better suited to cattle than people, and that he wasn't entirely sure that assumption had been wrong, but that he'd recently encountered evidence that complicated it. Evidence, she said. Specific and persuasive, he said. She was staying at his ranch that night, not because of anything that had been said or decided, but because the snow had gotten serious, and they'd both looked at it and reached the same conclusion without discussing it. She'd been doing that more, reaching conclusions alongside him without needing to narrate the process. She looked at him across the table. I'm not an easy person, she said. No, he agreed. I'm going to keep arguing with you about things. Expect so, and you're going to disappear into yourself sometimes, and I'm going to find it maddening, probably accurate. She held his gaze. I think this is worth the difficulty, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. So do I. That was how it was decided, which was not very romantic and was exactly right for both of them. Silas Marlowe's trial ran for 9 days in July. Tessa testified again. Shorter this time, because the documentary evidence was so complete that her testimony was corroboration rather than foundation. She sat in the same kind of room and said the same kinds of things and watched Pruitt try the same angles and find they'd all been sealed. Silas was convicted on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, bribery of public officials, falsification of land records across 3 counties over 11 years. The sentence was substantial. His estate was ordered dissolved and proceeds directed toward restitution for the 11 documented families, with Crow's office overseeing distribution. It would take 2 more years to fully process, and some families received more than others, and the property itself, in some cases, could not be returned because it had been developed or sold through legitimate subsequent transfer, and money was not the same as land, and everyone understood that was something. Miriam Holt received the assessed value of her husband's ranch and a formal finding that her complaints had been wrongfully suppressed. She stood in Crow's office when she received the finding and looked at it for a long time and said nothing, and then she folded it and put it in her dress the way she'd carried her letters for 7 years. The Vale property, 300 acres, 2 water rights, the house Ronan's father had built, was returned to Ronan through restitution order in the fall. The house was occupied by a tenant farmer who had bought it in good faith from Silas, and who had to be compensated separately, which complicated the timeline. But by November, the land was in Ronan's name. He rode out to look at it alone the first time. Tessa didn't offer to come, and he didn't ask her to. She understood that this was something he needed to do by himself, in the same way she'd needed to be alone with certain parts of this from the beginning. He was gone most of the day. When he came back quietly, unsaddled his horse, and came inside and sat at the kitchen table. She didn't ask. He would say what he needed to say when he'd sorted it. After a while, he said, "The foundation's solid. The walls need work. The roof on the north side has gone soft." She nodded. "But it's there," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for another moment. "I'm going to rebuild it," he said. "The north side of the roof first, before winter. It'll take most of next year to do it right. I know something about land documentation if you need help with the transfer papers," she said. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was almost a smile and was warmer than one. "I might need some help with that," he said. They married in the spring. Not a large event. Tessa had no family she wanted present. Her own family had been distant before Silas and more distant after, the way some families got when a woman's life complicated the story they wanted to tell about her. Ronan had a cousin in Colorado who made the ride, and Cal Denny came, and Cora and Miriam and Patience and Harold and Agnes Keel. Bryce came up from Garrett's Crossing. Crow sent a letter. It was a short ceremony, and then food, and then people sitting around talking for hours, which was what Tessa had always thought a good gathering should be not performed. Just people who knew each other, fed and warm. She became Tessa Vale. Red Hollow took a while to adjust, which she had expected. The town had spent 2 years with a particular version of her, and people didn't revise quickly. But the documentation office kept filling, and the people who came through it came out understanding things they hadn't understood before, and understanding creates its own kind of respect slower and more durable than the other kinds. By the second year, people who had once whispered about her size and her situation were waiting outside her door at opening time. Not because they'd changed their values, because she had proven useful, and in a working territory, useful was its own category of honor. Still a large woman. Still occupied space in the particular way of a woman whose body was built the way hers was built. She had not stopped noticing when people registered that she was never going to stop noticing, because that was in her now, worn in, but she had stopped measuring herself by what the noticing meant. There was a difference between knowing what someone's eyes did when they looked at you and letting that knowledge determine how much room you were allowed to take up. She had learned the difference. It had taken longer than it should have. It had required being seen clearly by a person who had no investment in the smaller version of her that was easier for other people to manage. She was honest enough to acknowledge that she might still be making herself small if Ronan hadn't looked at her across a cold room and seen the things she'd been trying to hide. Not her body, her courage. Those were not the same thing, and the confusion between them was something she thought about a lot in her documentation office. When she watched people come through the door with papers in their hands and fear in their faces, the specific fear of someone who doesn't understand the thing they're being asked to agree to, and who has been told their confusion is their own failure rather than the calculated obscurity of a document designed to confuse. She thought, I know this fear. I lived in this fear. The fear of the person who doesn't know the right words for the room they're standing in. And she thought, that's why I'm here. She was. Here because she understood what happened when power disguised itself as paperwork and called the confusion of its victims a personal failing. She was here because she had read a ledger she wasn't supposed to read and run through a storm she wasn't supposed to survive and walked back into a house she wasn't supposed to return to and stood up in a courthouse she wasn't supposed to have a voice in, and the thing she had learned from all of that was not that she was exceptional. It was that most people are capable of more than the people who benefit from their limitation will ever tell them. That was the lesson, not heroism. Not that the right person appearing at the right moment changes everything, though sometimes it helps. Sometimes the right person showing up at 3 a.m. makes the difference between possible and impossible. But the lesson underneath that, the one that stayed, you contain more than what was taken from you. Even after 2 years of someone carefully and deliberately removing pieces of you, something remained that they couldn't reach. Not because you protected it. You didn't always know it was there. But it was there. It survived. And the moment you gave it light, the moment one person looked at you and saw what you'd kept, rather than what had been taken, it was still capable of the thing it had always been capable of doing. Ronan still stared sometimes. She would look up from whatever she was working on, a deed, a letter, a contract spread across the kitchen table, and find him watching her from across the room with that particular quality of attention he'd had from the beginning. She would narrow her eyes. Ronan Vale. What? You're staring. I know. She would look back down at her papers. And she would feel not perform, not manage, not survive, just feel the specific, ordinary, enormous thing of being known by someone. Being seen without having to make yourself smaller to be acceptable. She had not known how much she missed that until she had it again. Not the romance of it, though. That was real, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. The simpler thing underneath the romance. Being in a room with another person and not spending any part of your energy calculating how much space you were allowed. That was the thing. That was what the cowboy who couldn't stop staring had given her without quite knowing that was what he was giving. And she had given him something too, which they had both been too careful to name directly, but which was evident in the way he talked about his father, now not the compressed, factual way he'd talked about it in the beginning, the emotion pressed down into dates and amounts, but something more open. He was still not a man who talked easily about difficult things, but he had stopped treating his grief like evidence of weakness, which meant he had stopped hiding it, which meant it had somewhere to go. They were both, in their different ways, learning how to stop carrying things that were finished. It was slow work, but they had time. They had the ranch and the office and the long Wyoming winters and the work that needed doing and the ordinary machinery of two people building something together, not without friction, not without the arguments she'd promised and the silences she'd warned him about, but building nonetheless. And years later, when the documentation office had helped 24 families and the Vale Ranch had been rebuilt properly on its original foundation, and Red Hollow had gotten used to the idea of a woman who understood land law better than most men in the county, Ronan still stopped sometimes. In the middle of whatever he was doing, feeding cattle, repairing fence, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee going cold, he would stop and look at his wife, and Tessa would catch him, the way she always did, because she had always been the kind of person who noticed things people didn't think she was noticing. "Don't look at me like that," she would say. And Ronan Vale, a man who had spent most of his life preferring cattle to conversation, who had found a frightened woman beside a muddy road and carried her in from the cold and looked at her face across a dark cabin and seen not what the world had done to her, but what she had refused to let the world take, would look at her and not stop, because he had known from the beginning what he was looking at. Not a woman who needed rescuing, not a body that the town had appointed itself to judge, not a wife that a lonely cowboy had happened into by accident. The most formidable person he had ever met, standing in his kitchen, telling him not to stare, and he was never going to stop.